Good evening and welcome. My name is Councillor Lewis Adam. This is Stratford-on-Avon District Council's Planning Committee. I'll just run through some housekeeping and then we'll move on to the agenda. First of all, there's no fire alarm plan, so if the alarm does go off, please make your way through the noted exits, and the muster point is the the car park by the pub across the road. To the public gallery and members alike, please make sure your phones are in silent mode or off so that they don't disturb the flow of the meeting. This is a meeting in public, not a public meeting, so only those registered to speak are permitted to do so. I'll call you forward at the appropriate time and give you further instructions at that point. And lastly, this meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the website and YouTube. Okay, I'll just introduce our top table from Committee Services. We have Olivia Quinn, we've got Sue Mullins, who is our solicitor this evening. Our planning manager is David Jeffries, and our planning officers are Malvina Itik and Amy Flute, and we also have from Everard Cole, John Heald. Apologies. David, do you have a statement you'd like to say?
I do, thank you, Chair. My name is David Jeffrey. I'm the planning manager for tonight's meeting. My role is to provide impartial advice to clarify any planning issues that arise and to assist members' decision-taking. Planning committee members are not bound by advice from officers or by their recommendations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, David. Okay, we can now move on then to our agenda. Item 1, apologies for absence.
Chair, we have apologies from Councillor Eden, Councillor Harding, Councillor Parry, who Councillor Organ is substituting for, Councillor Passingham, who Councillor Parker is substituting for, and Councillor Padgham, who Councillor Ostrander is substituting for.
Thank you very much. Item 2, disclosures of interest. Any disclosures from members? Councillor Hench-Serafin.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah. Item 4 on the agenda, 23/457. I paid a site visit, but I did not go actually onto the site. I viewed this building from the road. Okay.
Thank you very much. Councillor Organ.
Beg your pardon. Email correspondence from James Van Helden, which I assume everyone has had.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we've had that. Yes, we'll take that as a blanket. Any further disclosures? Councillor Holmes?
Yes, I am the ward member for item 4 of the agenda, application 23/03457 for Burford Barn. I'm supporting this application and will be stepping down from the committee for that part of the committee to speak in favour of the application.
Thank you very much. Any further disclosures? No, in which case we can move on to item 3, our first application. Application 23/01922/FUL Fox and Hounds in Morton in Marsh Road, Great Orford. Our presenting officer is Malvina. When you're ready, take it away.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening. So this application was scheduled to be heard during the 20th of March committee meeting. However, due to the lack of marketing information, it was invalidated, and following submission of the marketing information, the application was made valid again. The application site is located in Great Walford, as denoted by the black dot on the map. Fox and Hounds Inn is a Grade 2 listed building. The property, originally a farmhouse, dates back to the middle of the 17th century and is situated within a conservation area, as denoted by the pink outline. The site is also washed over by the Cotswolds Fringe Special Landscape Area designation. The public house is on the Asset of Community Value list. Planning permission is sought for a change of use of the public house to one dwelling, with no physical alterations to the building being proposed. The current slide shows the existing and proposed site plan. The next slide shows the existing and proposed floor plans. The application would create a 6-bedroom dwelling. This slide shows second floor plan and roof plan, again with no physical alterations. The next slide shows the elevations as existing and as proposed. This photograph shows the public house from the front. The next slide shows the public house from the rear. And again from the rear with the coach house on the left-hand side. Chair, the balanced recommendation is to grant the application for planning permission, subject to conditions detailed within the committee report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Okay, we now move on then to our first speaker, who is David Morgan, representing Walford's Joint Parish Council. Good evening, Mr. Morgan. So yes, if you'd like to take a seat in front of one of the microphones, it's the right-hand button to turn on the microphone. You have 3 minutes. I'm happy to give you a 30-second warning before your time expires.
Are we live?
Yes, you're on, yeah.
Hi there, my name's David Morgan. I'm a chartered surveyor. Just my firm, Morgan and Clark, has been dealing with licence and leisure property for some considerable time. I have specialised in licensed property since 1975, and I also own a pub. Whoops. My statement anyway today is to support the viability of the subject premises, which has at heart 3 specific features. First of all, the total sales. Secondly, the profit margin that's earned from those sales. And thirdly, the costs of the achievement of those sales. I issued a detailed report in August last year, which I hope has in fact been sort of read in its complete form. Since then, we've had a year of economic turmoil, which has led me to have another close look at the calculations. In that time, I consider that for all of the various site-specific reasons that the calculations still stand as being valid. Certainly concerning sales, the area is subject, of course, to the vagaries of anyway the marketplace and the discretionary leisure spend. However, I'm of the considered view that the area is less sensitive just than other areas that say have got blue collar or they're heavily wet dependent upon sales. This is an area that seems to thrive on the sort of provision of quality food from a large number of other premises, all of which seem anyway to be doing particularly well. The second element of the sort of general assessment is about the profit margins. I have adopted a 65% general margin, which is in contrast just with that was adopted just by Everard Cole, who happened to also deeply consider the viability of the property. In fact, my considered view is that the adoption of a 55% general margin is actually reflective of a supplied tied property, which this one isn't. It is free of tie. I also can cross-reference that with, in fact, my own.
I'll ask you to just wrap it up as quickly as possible now, please.
Okay. Finally, I then had a revised view of, in fact, the costs associated. And again, having looked at that within the round, I genuinely consider that they still hold as being valid.
Thank you. I'll ask you to stop there, but thank you very much for your contribution. Members, do we have any questions for our representative from the Parish Council? Yes, Councillor Keithley.
Oops. Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Morgan. Thank you for that. I've just got a couple of questions for you about the pub, if that's okay, and also your report, because I've read your report. There's some differences of opinion between all the reports that are presented.
I think
the pub, just the questions I'm going to ask you is, the pub looks very small, the car park looks tiny, the community is very small as well, under 180 people, I think, that live close to the pub, so people are going to have to come to the pub from elsewhere. Your report suggests this would be a destination pub. I'm interested to know why would they would choose to come to this pub rather than the plethora of pubs in Morton or Shipston or Chipping Norton or Stow-on-the-Wold or all these other places around, the towns where people tend to visit rather than the villages. Could you help me understand that, please?
I was heartened anyway today because I happened to take the trouble to go up to the Plough at Stratton, which is smaller in size, smaller car park. It's a completely destination venue, and I think that the subject premises is quite capable of having a strong destination sort of venue trade. The fact that there isn't a lot of on-site car parking doesn't really matter because there aren't any on-street restrictions. So you can park anywhere, sensibly that is, of course.
Any further questions? Councillor Harvey.
Good evening, Mr. Morgan. The Everard Cole report uses a particular methodology to come to its assessment. Have you got any views on the methodology used?
There is a similarity in the basic methodology. I take great exception, however, to the conclusions reached, and in that respect, I'm heartened by the fact that there are two independent offers that have been made to purchase the property from people that self-evidently consider the place as being viable.
Any further questions? No? In which case, thank you for your contribution this evening. Okay, we now move on to our next speaker, who is James Van Helden, on behalf of the pub campaign. Good evening. So you also have 3 minutes. I have to give you a 30-second warning before your time expires. It's the button on the right-hand side to turn on the microphone. And otherwise, once you're comfortable, take it away.
There are two key issues: the viability, as David Morgan's expert advice and evidence, and the local list marketing information. The marketing sales price of £550,000 for the pub is not a realistic sales price as required by the LPA's local list. The Everston Young valuation completed in 2019 at the time the pub was being marketed was £350,000. The Everett Co viability report dated 2023 confirmed a realistic market value of £375,000. Both these are evidence of an unrealistic sales price, and that the submitted marketing report fails to justify this sales price. Indeed, all the bids made to purchase a pub were realistic offers at that time. Simon Bell, counsel for the pub campaign, has submitted a 9-page legal representation dated the 14th of May on this issue about unrealistic sales price, stating that reliance of an out-of-date marketing exercise to justify the loss of a pub is unacceptable, and that the grant of permission would clearly be amendable to a judicial review challenge on the grounds of irrationality and also the failure to consider national and local policy correctly. This representation has been totally ignored by the case officer. A precedent has been set with the delegated report for the Cross Keys pub, where the application failed to meet CS25 regarding the asking price. As an unrealistic sales price has been set for the Fox and Hounds pub, this application fails to meet CS22 and CS25 as required by the local list. It should also be noted that 2 pubs have reopened, another pub sold and under new management, and yet another pub sold and now under renovation, all within the past 12 months. These transactions ranged from 350,000 to 450,000. Thus further confirming the unrealistic sales price that there is clearly a demand to acquire food-led destination pubs. It is a pub campaign's urge to committee members to refuse this application, as the community asset can be reopened and once more deliver the social and economic benefits this pub provided in the past for the sake of the local communities.
Thank you very much. Just hang on time. Okay, thank you. Members, do we have any questions for our speaker? Councillor Keithley.
Thank you, Mr. Van Elden. Thanks very much for that. I'm interested to know why the pub closed, or why the pub was offered for sale in the first place, because the new owners bought it in about 2015. And there are reports that I've read, submissions, that the pub only operated for a few months, whereas in other areas it's suggested the pub operated for a couple of years before it subsequently closed again. Can you enlighten me on that?
Yes, of course. So the Everard Co report said that the pub stayed open for 13 months and then closed in 2016. Okay? The reason for closing was, I guess, some issues with the way the pub was being run. In fact, some of the conflicts with locals as well, and also the services provided by the owners of the pub. So opening hours not regular, the food offering for the people to eat there, not of a level that people were expecting. So the general service and the way that the pub was operating was not what people wanted to visit the pub for.
Just to follow up on my first point, if you don't mind, Mr. Van Elden, it was to do with the pub coming up for sale in the first place, because it must have changed hands in about 2014. Do you know anything about that?
No, the pub, the previous owners, the landlady had poor health, and the pub was then taken back by the lenders, Santander, who took over the pub. It was then subjugated, it was then put back on the market.
Any further questions? Councillor Fleming.
This seems to be a familiar story. Upper Brails had a pub that something went through a similar exercise. Change a landlord. I mean, the whole success of a pub is down to the landlord. And we know from past experience that sometimes owners of pubs put in landlords that really don't know what they're doing and how they make a success.
Councillor Fleming, can you come to a question, please?
Yeah, the question is, do you think that A, the price was set too high in the first place, so it was never intended to be sold as a pub, and B, was the landlord positioned so that he would never make a success of it?
I totally concur with what you're saying there. So the asking price when the pub was marketed of £550,000 was way over the valuations of the pub at that time. So that put people off making bids. And in fact, the bids that were made following the marketing exercise were all realistic. So, and the whole point is that the marketing exercise was deficient because it didn't justify the sales price of £550,000. And what's more, the local list makes it absolutely clear that the marketing report has to explain why those bids were not proceeded. Now, in this particular instance, the agent for the applicants has written back, so that was not included in the original marketing report 5 years ago, but the agent...
I think you've addressed the point that Councillor Fleming had, but thank you. Thank you. Councillor Keithley, do you have another question?
I do, thank you, Chair. I mean, clearly there's a great deal of support to save this pub, as evidenced by everybody that's turned up tonight. One question I've got, though, is given that it's been closed since 2016, which is now 8 years, why is no, since there is such a huge level of support for it and so much money has been spent on the campaign, why has there not been an approach by the community to actually take over and run this pub as a community pub? Since you've had pop-up pubs and other such stuff in the village, why have they not come forward with an offer to take it over for the community?
It goes back down to the price that the pub was marketed, £550,000. So at that time, the valuation of the pub was £350,000. If it was at a sensible, realistic market, yes, we could have raised the funds and had a community pub. So this is a well-trodden path by developers putting the pub at an unrealistic price to put off bids. So, yeah.
Just a very quick follow-up to that, if you don't mind. Did the community actually make an offer? Because other offers were made for the pub, admittedly refused or didn't get further. Did the community come forward with an offer at all?
Yes, the answer to that question is yes. So as soon as the pub closed, there was a group of investors made an offer of £400,000, which was considered to be realistic. And Councillor Joe Baker was there at that meeting.
Thank you. Any further questions for our speaker? No, in which case, thank you very much for your contribution this evening. We'll now move on then to our next speaker, who is Gary Dickens, and two speakers, Gary Dickens and Simon Firkins, agent and applicant, respectively. Good evening. Just to let you know, so you have 6 minutes. The previous speakers went over it slightly, so I'm happy to give you some leeway, but obviously that's fairly length of time anyway. So just to let you know, I'll have to give you a 30-second warning before your time expires. And it's a button on the right-hand side to turn on the microphone.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair, members. Thank you again for allowing us the opportunity to speak in support of this application. We were here last year for the previous application to change the pub to 2 dwellings. That application was refused as per the officer's recommendation, as the 2 dwellings were not considered to be the optimum viable use with the least possible harm to the listed building. That was the only reason for the refusal. The application was not refused due to the loss of the pub as a community facility or for any other reason. A thorough debate took place around that subject, and members rightly determined compliance with policy CS25 as well as policy CS22 insofar as it might have been relevant. This fresh application therefore fully addresses the only reason for refusal last time by proposing a change of use to a single dwelling. Officers previously confirmed that this is what they wanted to see proposed, and the applicant has responded to that. There has been no material change in policy since the last decision, and with this application fully addressing the only reason for refusal from last time, there is no justifiable planning reason for the application to be refused. We therefore ask you to endorse the officer recommendation. We fully appreciate that this is not an easy decision to make, given the extent and strength of objections, which is not uncommon for proposals of this nature. Pubs are often an important element of the community, and it is right they receive more protection than some other uses. At the same time, national and specific local plan policy is clear that the change of use of a pub is acceptable where strict criteria are met. As a result of many, many reasons outside of the applicant's control, the current use is no longer viable and has not been viable for some time. It is regrettable, but there can be no doubt that the very strict criteria set out in policy CS25 has been met, and there is no policy or other planning-based reason to resist the change of use. This is fully set out in the officer report, with the Council's independent viability consultant explaining very clearly why the viability assessment by the Pub Campaign Group is seriously flawed and lacks credibility. I am not a viability consultant.
Please.
I am not a viability consultant and have no desire to get drawn into debate around that subject. 3 different viability experts have been involved here. 2 of those, including the independent one on behalf of the Council, have no doubt the pub is not viable with no prospect of becoming viable. That independent consultant is here tonight to assist you on this point. Whilst I'm sure objectors will try to tell you otherwise, we can see no reason to go against that independent advice or the decision made by members on the same point just last year. We are aware of aspirations to alter the wording of the policy, but that is something for the local plan process, with appropriate consultation and review and independent assessment by a plan inspector. We recognise that suggestions have been submitted for this application to be considered against how the policy might look in future. We can understand that desire, but to do so would be wrong in accordance with established case law and completely unreasonable in planning terms. The point raised by objectors about the validation checklist is similar. This was altered recently, but only after this application was validated. The application can only be judged against the criteria relevant to it at the time. It is not possible nor right to seek to apply retrospectively and to an already valid application details contained in a subsequently updated checklist. The officer report confirms this in paragraph 10.1. In summary, this case relates to the viability or not of the pub. The applicant has provided officers with all the information asked for to assess the proposal against adopted policy CS25. Independent consultants instructed by the Council have further assessed viability and are unequivocal about its lack of viability. There are no objections from any technical consultees, and the recommendation here is clear. Whilst I appreciate it might not be an easy task based on the planning history and the facts in front of you, there is no other reasonable option but to grant planning permission as recommended. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well within your time. Members, do we have any questions for Agent for the applicant? Councillor Keithley.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good evening, Mr. Firkin. Thanks very much. I've got this nagging question in my mind about the valuation process and why it was marketed at such a high figure, starting off at, I think, 675, then reduced to 550. I asked a specific question of Mr. Van Helden about whether or not the community had offered something for the pub. And in my mind, I've got this figure of more like 350 to 400 as being a valuation. Can you help me understand how your valuations came about, please?
So slightly before my personal time involved, okay. But obviously they went to our clients, the applicants who are here tonight, went to an agent and they come up with that valuation. The valuation is obviously what they were seeking to achieve, given the money they spent buying the pub and other elements, and that valuation in their view wasn't met.
Okay, thanks.
Any further questions for our speaker? No? In which case, thank you for your contribution this evening.
Can I just clarify? My name is Gary Dickens. Simon Firkins. That's okay. Simon Firkins is the agent, but he's not here tonight, so I'm speaking in his place. So there's only one speaker.
Thank you very much for clarifying that. Much appreciated. Okay, and Very good. Okay, we'll move on then to our final speaker, who is Ward Member Councillor Wally Hoggins. Good evening, Councillor. Yes, so as you know, you've got 5 minutes. I have to give you a 30-second warning. Otherwise, once you're situated, take away.
It is an outrage that we all find ourselves in this council chamber to discuss the merits of yet another audacious and vexatious, totally new application to convert the Fox and Hounds pub into residential use. The majority of people in this room do not identify as fools, so therefore we can all see that this is just one front door less from being the same you-know-what in the same location that was discussed the last time. You will see that there is an impressive history of these applicants attempting to get planning permission to convert this pub into a residential dwelling. It is a very great pity that the same applicants and owners didn't show the same level of tenacity and determination to run the Fox and Hounds successfully. As a result of a cross-party working and a collegiate approach amongst elected councillors and planning officers, this district now has a detailed planning advice note designed to protect pubs across the district, as these are valuable assets and prevent the loss of public houses to developers. These applicants are developers. They've even featured on Homes Under the Hammer. As part of the work completed on the planning advice note, Alice Cosnett, planning team leader, said the following: "We agree that the advice note should be updated to clarify that the marketing process should be undertaken within close proximity to the submission of an application for the pub's change of use. Council suggested no more than 6 months between the end of the marketing period and the submission of the planning application, which I consider to be entirely reasonable. So it is entirely unreasonable that this entire application seems to be given merit on the basis of a valuation that is 5 years out of date. The correspondence regarding the valuation figure made reference to a Tom Stanley who should be able to corroborate the marketing price of the pub. No such written corroboration has been received or published. In an extraordinary comment by Everard Cole report, page 28, the author says, "It appears this marketing was done as a planning exercise and the owners had no intention of selling the property at the time." And Andy Rutley of a nearby pub has offered to buy this pub, as has another person called David Marina. Their offers unequivocally demonstrate the viability of this pub. Appropriate and proper marketing is fundamental evidence in assessing the viability of a pub. This evidence is missing and the reason for omission obvious. I am both staggered and alarmed that the representation made by the barrister has been ignored. I applaud every person and organisation who have taken the time and trouble to add an objection to this application. I applaud all those who have stood out in all weathers at all times of the year to participate in pop-up pub events, demonstrating unequivocally that the village and the wider community support and need a pub. The 50th latest pop-up pub was supported by this district's newly elected MP and by the deputy leader of this council, he said, with regard to the planning advice note and the need to protect pubs, "This much-needed piece of work will allow the District Council to ensure it is enforcing planning policies to their full extent and preventing the loss of public houses that play such an important part in the lives of so many of our residents. This pub is listed as an ACV. This pub has been recognised as an ACV for generations and has always been of great importance and a beating heart to both the current community and for 300 years. There is inadequate and flawed evidence that the pub has no viable future, and it does not demonstrate that any of the criteria set out under policy CS25 have been properly considered or satisfied. Critically, planning policy CS22, local employment opportunities must be a priority, especially in areas where there is a lack of public transport. This fact has been willfully disregarded, which is deplorable. So I ask that each of you consider the implications very carefully if you seek to agree with the officer. By agreeing to this, every village and community in your ward and the district as a whole will be alarmed if they've got a pub, because the approval of this would make a mockery of registering any assets of community value across the district. And furthermore, the fact that the planning officer gives no weight to the planning advice note makes a mockery of this council and the work we do as councillors. This council was unanimous in adopting the pub protection planning note at full council this July, and I urge this committee to be unanimous in its decision to refuse this application. It is essential that this committee refuses this application on the grounds that you are not satisfied that this pub is not viable, because the marketing is out of date and the market price is unrealistic, and because there are 2 recent local offers to purchase the pub. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, do we have any questions for our ward member? Councillor Keithley.
I have a question, if I dare ask it. I just let my ears settle down a bit as well. Yeah, we're very worried about losing pubs, weary travellers turning up, seeking refreshment, glass of Prosecco when they park their Range Rovers and such like. There's a couple of things...
Please.
Thank you. The valuation, I admit, is one area of concern. But another area of concern for us to consider is the expert advice of an independent assessor who's assessed the ongoing viability of the pub with its turnover, its margins, its costs and such like. Why do you think that we should pay less attention to the independent valuer's assessment of whether or not this pub is viable than an assessor who's working on behalf of a campaign group?
I think the crux of the matter with these so-called independent reports is that, in fact, any conversations could happen between the applicant and the independent people doing that assessment, because by the very nature of them, they're going to enter into conversations regarding, you know, what's gone before, etc. And also, of critical importance is that I have long doubted the independence of such reports, because these are actually paid for by the applicant. And I remember in one of the previous applications that the applicants for this pub actually wanted a list to pick from for their independent valuation viability. And that, to me, is a most alarming scenario, really. And I think that I don't think that either of them should be dismissed in favour of the other one, but I do think that there has to be some balance with this. And I think that also with the report, the so-called independent report, regrettably, Everard Cole are based in Nottingham, not in the Cotswolds, and not in an area that is could be construed as being similar to the Cotswolds. It's not a holiday destination. Not many people that I know go to Nottingham for a holiday. People do go down to Dorset, whereas the gentleman that was here, the first speaker here, is based in Dorset. So he has a really good idea of what the holiday sort of industry is like. It is thriving in my location, and yes, I note there are Range Rover drivers. There's quite a few electric vehicle drivers as well. And I would just say that there was a jibe about it, so I would like to address that. It is these people that are bringing the vast amounts of money into the economy in the rural areas, in this rural area, and we do need to acknowledge that. And I think...
Thank you, Councillor. I think you've addressed the question. Thank you very much. Any further questions? Councillor Organ.
Thank you, Chair. It's the adoption of the planning advisory note that I'm interested in. I know you were heavily involved in that. And I wondered whether you had any understanding of when that policy advice note was actually going to be valid from. Was it actually stipulated that it was only valid on new applications that came in, or was it going to be valid from the time it was adopted?
To help you with that, the legal advice that's been received from the barrister is that this planning advice note will be taken into consideration even if, and there are, appeals going forward. So anything that happens while an appeal process is taking place, this becomes valid. This is entirely valid. this is valid. And I'm sure that the applicant's agent would very much like you to believe that that is not the case. But I received categoric assurances that this would apply to the Fox and Hounds in Great Wolford. And that is why such diligent work was done on this, why the cross-collegiate approach was so very, very fruitful. And, you know, we worked amazingly well together to protect these pubs. And I'll be frank, it was me that wrote the notice of motion, but because I was away on holiday, I couldn't actually bring it to fruition, particularly in mind of saving pubs like the Fox and Hounds. We lost the George in the gate in Brailes. We can't have this just continually happening. It is
Thank
woeful.
you, Councillor. I
Thank
believe
you.
you've answered the question. Any further questions? Councillor Harvey.
Councillor Worley-Hoggins, the Everard Cole assessment is that particular firm's view of the viability of the pub. And one of the significant costs that are accounted for in the relevant calculation is the cost of financing the pub, i.e. the cost of capital. On my reading, the report uses a fair market value of £375,000 for the Fox and Hounds. What do you think of that figure?
I think that a fair valuation of £375,000 is fairer than the original asking price, which was, you know, £650,000. I mean, that was just designed to put off applicants. I think if this pub was marketed tomorrow at the price of £375,000, this pub would be sold probably by the end of the month. Such is the demand for pubs.
Thank you. Any further questions for our ward member? No. In which case, thank you very much for contribution. Thank you. Right, members, we now move on to points of clarification from our officers, and I'll remind everyone that we have John Hald from Everard Cole as well for any questions directing regarding the viability report. Do we have any points of clarification? Councillor Holmes first.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question. I just wanted to ask why the officers hadn't given more weight to the planning advice note that was voted on at full council in July.
We have covered the weight to be afforded the planning advice note in the officer's report. It is a material consideration. It is not planning policy.
Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chairman. I wonder if you could explain the relationship between the local list and the core strategy. There are words in the local list which do not appear in the core strategy and are not policy.
I think you've summed it up with your final words there. The local list is a guide to help applicants and officers get applications to a point where they contain all the information necessary to determine an application. When we come to make a decision on planning applications, they must be determined in accordance with the development plan and the material considerations apparent to us at the time of the decision.
Thank you for that. Am I right in thinking that the officers regard the marketing information that has been submitted on the basis that it's 5 years old, that it's not relevant? And am I correct in thinking that the officer has come to her view in making her recommendation based upon viability assessment and nothing else?
I think this comes down to an interpretation of CS25, which requires the development proposal only to conform with one of the criteria for it to be considered acceptable. One of the criteria is marketing, and one of the criteria is that it's commercially viable. So they're essentially two separate assessments. We've looked at both. we have taken the view that it's not a commercially viable operation on the basis of the advice from an independent consultant, and having regard to all the evidence that's been presented before us. Some of the evidence relates to previous marketing of this pub. It has taken place some time ago, and members should bear that in mind when they weigh up how much weight to afford that particular aspect of the evidence.
Thank you. If you've got a quick... Okay, thank you. Councillor Fleming?
Thank you. A couple of questions. First one, if I may. Has the officer visited the premises and looked at it inside and out before making a decision recently, you know, since we got this recommendation to grant?
Thank you, Councillor. So a site visit was undertaken during the last application.
Right.
And photographs taken. Thank you.
Okay, so, sorry, if I can just follow up with that. So that's not recently, that was the last application. What was that, back in March or something like that, was it?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, as this thing...
Sorry,
here,
just to clarify, like external visit was undertaken during the course of this application, but I didn't...
so you didn't go inside?
Go inside, no.
Oh, right, okay, thank you. Next thing is, this thing here, this planning advice note, it was cross-party, it was supported unanimously, and as councillors we're a bit disappointed that there's virtually no weight being given to this in this application. And you start to wonder what the point of councillors are if we're going to do this documentation. So when are you going to convert this to policy that we can actually rely on?
The South Warwickshire Local Plan will take into account the considerations within the planning advice note on public houses. I'm sure it will incorporate some consideration as to whether policies can be afforded weight in that progress. I was involved in the preparation of the planning advice note on public houses. Throughout that process, it was made clear that this was not forming policy.
Thank you. Councillor Parker next.
Thank you. I mean, there are many aspects I would like to dig into on this, but I think the one I want to restrict myself to at the moment, because this is a subject which I have in my own ward, where a property which is not a dwelling is brought forward and market testing requested by the council. And the sale price that the applicant hopes to achieve is that when it's been developed with residential buildings and is not the value of the existing usage of that area. So I had it was a cattery, no longer a cattery, put it on the market.
Just very briefly, can you formulate a question based on this application?
So the question is, how is this process regulated within the planning department?
So we have 3 separate reports on the viability of the pub, which all take into consideration marketing and have opinions about what the existing use value of the pub is. Questions about hope value or expected use value, probably considerations for the viability consultant. If you have any comment, John?
Well, from a viability, from the assessment I did, the perspective is that the marketing and the price that the property was marketed at was an irrelevance to the calculations and the assessment I was doing. That's why you find in the report I formulated what I perceived to be a more realistic market value for the property to work out the property costs from there. That's how it's so whilst you would look at the marketing history. If that doesn't corroborate with my view of a realistic marketing figure or a realistic price for the building, for the business, then I would formulate my own as I did in the report here.
Can I just come back for a second? Sorry, so I guess my point, I'll try and put it more succinctly, is that, and I don't want to talk about the pub specifically because this is a more generic point, so I'm going to talk about the cattery. The cattery has a certain...
Sorry, Councillor Parker, we've got to this points of clarification. We can make points of debate in the next section, but this is just points of clarification from our officers at this point on this application.
I think I still don't quite understand, sorry, how is the applicant, how do they set the price and how are they tested that they've done a genuine market test if they've set the price at a value that they wish to realise, not at a value which is likely to be realised by the site as it stands. I'll desist at this point.
So I think the reason that your previous question got the answer it did from John is because we're considering policy CS25 of the core strategy. It separates out considerations relating to, number one, the realistic prospect of the facility continuing for commercial or operational reasons, and separately that the land has been actively marketed, and that's a separate consideration under number two, and our assessment has principally been made under part one in respect of the viability and realism of the facility continuing as a pub, rather than us saying that this has been robustly marketed and nobody took it up.
I'll ask the public gallery to be quiet. We've entertained some comments already, but at the moment it's starting to sway into disrupting the flow of the meeting. So can I please ask you to desist? Councillor Keithley.
Thank you, Chair. It's really a follow-up question to Councillor Parker's question. If I could put the question to John. What you've explained is that you've looked at the viability of the pub in respect of things like the gross operating profit costs, whether or not the turnover can be grown. And what we've heard is that that's been the predominant test for this. But what I'm interested to know is how does that then square with people that have made offers for this pub that are planning to run it as a pub? Because it appears that offers have been made, although not accepted, but they were happy to run it as a pub. So if they were happy to run it as a pub, and you take out the actual costs of buying the pub, and you focus on the running costs of the pub and the profitability of the pub, then the people that have made offers must have thought that they could make a go of it.
Yes, within the report, within the viability report, you look at the market value of the property for the sole reason as to ascertain the property costs involved. When you're looking at, so as you've seen in the report, there are inputs and outputs. And if the business has in the valuer's opinion or the surveyor's opinion, profitable, then it's viable. If it's not, then it's unviable. There are, I can count, there are numerous instances I know of personally where there are wealthy individuals who have acquired sites and they're running them at loss. Now, if they choose to do that, so be it. But the question that I've been asked is the viability. Is it viable? It's not whether or not someone is prepared to operate an unviable business. And there are people that do that.
Okay, thank you.
I think to add further, members need to be aware that that is the question which planning policy asks, which is why officers ask that question of John and not another question as in, would anybody be prepared to run this if there was no profit in it?
Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chairman. I wonder if I could ask Mr. Heald a question. There seems to be an agreement with Mr. Morgan that the methodology that you used in your report is accepted. It's not a point of great discussion. And on that basis, then the results from the exercise should be accepted by both organisations, so to speak. On 3 occasions last year, you issued addendums in response to criticism from Parish Council and from Morgan and Clark, where they raised issues which criticised your report. And yet you maintained your view that the pub was unviable. In fact, in your December report, you said it's even more unviable because of increased costs in the meantime. That's my reading of it. So I wonder if you could explain for the members here, what's the difference, the essential differences between the Morgan and Clark report and why it came to its conclusions and why you've come to your conclusions? What are those key differences?
I think Mr. Morgan briefly outlined it. As you say, I think we're in agreement the methodology is the same, which is pretty much the same you'll find in most viability reports. I think there are 3 points of difference. The inputs, i.e. the total sales, we clearly differ on that. The profit margins and also the costs, so the outgoings. And I think they're really the 3 disparities that create the difference.
Yeah. Is there a supplementary?
Could you say something more about depreciation and cost of finance, please, in your whether they should be in your calculations or whether they shouldn't, whether they were in Mr. Morgan's or whether they shouldn't, etc.?
Well, certainly the cost of finance, absolutely. And indeed, depreciation is taken as well, although it wasn't done so in these calculations, because it was so far in the negative, it wasn't worth looking at. But certainly, to operate a business, whether you either buy the freehold or you take a lease, there are property costs, whether that be repayment of the mortgage or a rent, and they need to be accounted for. They are a cost of the business, and they do need to be accounted for.
Thank you. Councillor Ostrander.
Hi. I'd just like to clarify a couple of those points that you've just raised to do with the inputs and the outputs. Can you just firstly confirm that you actually felt the costs of running this pub were higher than those suggested by Everard Coles?
No, I am Everard Cole.
Yeah, then Morgan and Clark.
Yes, I think if I remember rightly, Mr. Morgan was in at 45% of income, which is, in my opinion, I think in most other, if you look at any reports or anything like that, for a business of that size, particularly nowadays, you'd probably be 50% plus. So there's a good 5% margin there where I feel Mr. Morgan's short on the costs.
Okay. And in terms of wet and dry sales, it seems that and Mr. Morgan commented on this, so dry sales being food sales, it seems to me, looking at the figures, that is perhaps where the greatest difference lies in terms of your estimates as to how much profits would be made from those 2 areas.
Well, there is a big difference, clearly.
Yeah, could you talk to me about why that is? It's more than double the difference. There's a very big difference there. So could you talk me through that a little bit?
I don't think it is more than double. I don't think it is more than double.
Okay, well, maybe I'm looking at the wrong figures. Could you talk me through the figures then?
Yes, well, initially, looking at, going back to your initial point, if Mr. Morgan applied the same kind of profit margins and costs, which I suggest he would, then that would bring down his profit quite considerably. And then once taken in operators' remuneration and property costs, I think that itself would render his calculations unviable or very, very marginal. In terms of the inputs, I mean, you'd have to ask Mr. Morgan how he arrived at those, but certainly for me, in my experience, I thought that business, as it was, could operate about £3,000 a week, because of its rural location. It's extremely limited population density. I mean, there's been references made to the plough at Stretton. No reference has been made that that has over double the immediate population density within a kilometre radius. And also the size of the trading areas, which inevitably limit trade. I looked at similar properties. The plough at Stretton at the time, I think, was a turnover 155,000. The gate at Upper Brails has been mentioned before. That was £1,800 a week, which was less than £100,000 a year. I arrived at my conclusions accordingly.
Councillor Henry-Sheridan.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask you a question? Did you take into account that the community offer 400,000, and if they ran it as a community pub, would that be the most viable way of running that pub? The costs? Because most of the people would be volunteers.
Until this year, I was aware a community made an offer that were detailed in my report were what were in the, was it Robert, I think, I'm trying to remember the agents who they had. I don't think it mentioned a community offer. I guess if you're asking about how viable a community operation may be, that in itself has a number of questions. How is that going to be operated? Is it going to be under management, a direct manager paid for through the business? Is it going to be tenanted out? Would it be unpaid for staff, from the community? There's been a number of various community projects that all run variously on different bases. So I've known one in Derbyshire, which a community acquired the site, ran it for 4 years at a loss every year, and had to sell it last year to a local pub company. They kept the pub going, but essentially that pub was still unviable, i.e. not making a profit throughout their period of tenure.
So I've got a question that I'll raise, and I'll move on to others, but I'm keen to get onto the debate. And it is, I suppose, to John, we've gone into some detail over the reports and the differences between your report and Morgan's report. I suppose moving out to a slightly more macro scale and looking at the principle of those, both are accepted as being valid reports with sound methodologies, albeit that they are different. And obviously they've got different outcomes. Essentially, I'm trying to determine where the subjectivity of that comes into it and where the objectivity comes into it. Can you just, from your professional point of view, comment on that aspect of it as opposed to going into the detail?
I suppose the objectivity comes within the methodology. If the process is essentially the same and the correct methodology.
Ask him to speak into the mic.
Sorry. I said essentially the objectivity, I think, will come from with the methodology. The subjectivity, I think, inevitably is the inputs and the assumed turnover, the gross profit margins, and the outgoings, the costs. I think they are essentially the subjective elements, and a respective surveyor would look at those, draw on his own experience, draw on comparable evidence from as far and wide as he possibly could, I guess, to make those judgments.
Thank you. That's very useful. Oh, go on.
Yeah, I think we would add from the officer's point of view that that John here represents Everard Cole, who was independently instructed by your officers to provide independent, unbiased advice on the viability of the pub. That's not to say that other evidence that's been presented is of no value, and John has, as you've heard, responded to a number of aspects of evidence that have been put before him over the process of the application, but members should be mindful that we have instructed John to give us this independent advice.
Thank you, that's appreciated. Councillor Harvey.
Can I ask a question on a related but quite different matter that hasn't had much airing this evening, and that is the statutory obligations on decision makers under the Town and Country Planning Act in relation to listed buildings and conservation areas. Page 29 summarises the officer's view on that, taking into account the views submitted by the conservation officer, but it doesn't actually state what weight you have given in coming to that, what weight this particular element has played in your assessment and recommendation. I'd be grateful if you could give some sort of indication of how much weight members might be minded to give to this statutory responsibility.
So full weight, the statutory responsibility and CS8 core strategy policy carry full weight in the determination of the planning application as it relates to heritage assets. The conservation officers' expert advice is that the use of this building for a single dwelling is its optimum viable use in respect of the building itself and the impacts upon its historic significance. I think that's led to the conclusion of the planning officer that the proposals accord with CS8 and the parts of government guidance in the NPPF that relate to that.
Thank you. Councillor Scorer?
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, it's not within the AOMB. It's very close, 350 metres away. Would the officers have a different view if it was in the AOMB? And how much weight would you have given that?
I think that would be speculation, and I wouldn't be minded to comment, although I would say that we should not put a buffer zone around the boundaries of the AONB. It's outside the AONB, and policies that affect the AONB do not apply.
Thank you. Any further points of clarification? Councillor Strand?
Yeah, a quick one. Just about the Everard Cole report. I'm now a little bit confused about its independence or not. You are suggesting that it's an independent report. Councillor Wally Hoggan, the ward member, suggested, I believe, that maybe there was not, that it was not. Can I just clarify who instructed Everard Cole?
You may. Officers of this council instructed Everard Cole and set the terms of reference for this piece of work. The costs of the work are met by the applicant. That is as per the council's local list.
So, okay, so just to clarify, you chose Everard Cole, not the applicant?
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further points of clarification? No, in which case we can move to debate. Who would like to start? Councillor Keighley.
Thanks, Chair. Right, this is extremely difficult, obviously. We've had a good debate about it and lots of questions, which has been really helpful. And I know the strength of feeling in the audience, that's absolutely clear. And the passion as well about not wanting to lose this pub, which came across very clearly in Councillor Wally Hoggins's statement. But for me, this decision hinges on whether or not the pub is viable or not. That's what I've come down to. I think if I consider it not being viable and it not offering sufficient profit to somebody to manage it as a profitable concern, and that's taking account of the expert on my right, John, within the range of estimates that he's used and the sensitivity of his analysis on costs, turnover, margins and such like. I think I'm feeling that it isn't going to be profitable because I think that, I mean, we can look at best and worst case scenarios, but I think this is an independent report. Truthfully, I feel I have more confidence in the Everard Cole trading assessment than I do in the other reports that have been put forward. So that's in my mind for the no, it's not viable. However, also in my mind is perhaps it is viable. Some people are prepared to buy it, it seems. Offers have been made for somebody to run it. At whatever the price is to buy it, 375, 400,000, we've heard that 2 offers are on the table. We've heard that the community is interested in buying it or put forward something. So I think there potentially is a realistic prospect. That's not for a minute calling into question the quality of the evidence that John has put forward, because it's very detailed and he's done, I think, a very, very good job on behalf of the council, seeking an independent assessment. But I do think, in my mind, there's still a bit of a yes, and I come then on to policy CS25, because that's the policy we've got to measure this against. And policy CS25-1 says, there is no realistic prospect of it continuing for commercial reasons. And in my mind, I'm not actually convinced at the moment that there is no realistic prospect of it continuing. So that's where I am. I'm not making a proposal, but I'm just setting out the no's and the yeses. So I'd be interested to hear what others have to say. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Keithley. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chairman. This is an application for change of use from a pub to a residence. It's not an application for development, and therefore CS25 is irrelevant, i.e. a need identified by the local community, that element. The identity and or the motivation of the applicant is not a relevant consideration. It's not a planning matter. The property is a Grade 2 listed building within a conservation area. Section 66 of the Town and Country Planning Act requires that planning decision takers shall have special regard to the desirability of preserving the building. In relation to conservation areas, Section 72 specifies that decision takers will pay special attention to the desirability of preserving or enhancing the character or appearance of the area. The Council's Conservation Officer has no objection to the change, provided the pub is considered to be unviable. He also accepts that the change of use would cause less than substantial harm. The relevant elements of the core strategy, as Councillor Keithley has mentioned, CS22 and CS25, require a test of viability, and we have 3 tests which we've discussed at some length. It's usually the case that when an expert is consulted by the Council in relation to an application, for instance, the Highways Authority, their assessment is respected and their advice is followed. It would usually take alternate expert advice to provide an evidential basis for not accepting the expert advice upon which the case officer has relied. In this instance, the assessment of the independent assessor is being challenged. The crux of the basis for the determination of this application seems to me to be whether or not the Fox and Hounds is or has the prospect of becoming a commercially viable business or not. If the pub is assessed not to be a viable going concern, the tests required by CS22 and 25 will have been satisfied and the change of use sought should be granted. Everard Cole has responded to comments, views and analysis provided by both the Walford Joint Parish Council and Morgan and Clark in March 23, September 23 and December 23. Everard Cole has, despite the comments of these parties, maintained its assessment that the Fox and Hounds is, quote, not an opportunity or undertaking that is economically viable. Given what's been presented to this committee this evening, I have not been persuaded that there is material planning reason to do other than to accept the recommendation of the case officer to protect the listed building and the conservation area by granting the request change of use.
Thank you, Councillor. Yes, I believe Mr. Jeffries has something you'd like to say.
Thank you, Chair. I just wish to briefly comment and remark in respect of the definition of development under the 1990 Act. It does include a material change of use.
Councillor Parker.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I'm afraid I'm in a different camp to Councillor Keithley and Harvey. I don't think this is about whether the pub is viable, because last I looked, we live in a capitalist society and it's down to the market to make that judgment. And this is a raving socialist speaking. Off my stride slightly. So what it comes down to for me is the market testing. And I tried earlier in vain to probe on this subject, and it may well be me that is the weak link and not others who are explaining it to me. But ultimately, if this is a dwelling, then it does have a value, I'm sure, of the 675, 650,000 that has been mentioned previously. If it has to remain as a pub, and this decision largely rests in this room today, then it has a much lower value of maybe 375, 400,000. There's been all manner of numbers banded around. And so what it comes down to is, when we ask for market testing, this is market testing to demonstrate the validity that it can still be retained as an employer and as a business. And that market testing was done, and it seems to me that the market found that there was interest at a rate which was appropriate for the pub. But it was rejected because ultimately the applicant would like a greater sum because they have in their sights the fact that it could be a dwelling. And I understand that Mr. Jeffrey did use a pertinent development or planning word for that, bettering, I think it was, or something. But I remain of the belief currently that it's viable as a pub because someone wants to buy it and the market has demonstrated that handsomely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Fleming.
I'm kind of echoing what my colleague here says. I think we're in a completely contrived situation, in as much as this pub was obviously doing okay before the current people bought it off the liquidator when it eventually went broke. But it was a question of the pub was successful until the latest landlord was in there and ran it down. Did he do it because he was incompetent, or did he do it under instruction? And the whole point about it is that the current applicant bought it from, I think it was Santander or whoever repossessed the property. And he's trying to maximise or sweat his asset, basically. And this is purely down to a financial decision. He's rejected 400,000. He'd really like 600,000. But at the end of the day, it is all about money. His concern for the property isn't about the property. His concern is about the money. So from that perspective, I won't be going along with the officer's recommendation because it'll pull the guts out of the village. I know it's been empty for a few years. But the thing is, while it's been empty for a few years, people have got hope. They're hoping that they can get it back to being a pub. The minute we say you can't have it back as a pub, their hope's gone, and the village loses its hope that it'll have an asset. So I won't be going along with the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. I believe the next speaker I had on my list was Councillor Keithley again.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, only just coming back on those points. I did make it quite clear that I felt confident in the assessment of profitability as an ongoing concern that had been made by the expert on my right. However, I accept what Councillor Fleming and Councillor Parker have said, that some people appear to be prepared to buy it and run it as a pub. And I go back to CS25, pick up what Councillor Harvey said as well. There is no realistic prospect of it continuing for commercial reasons on that site. It doesn't say economic reasons. It says commercial and or operational reasons. So I'm not sure that making a statement, unless I haven't got the full policy in front of me, Councillor Harvey's just looking it up, I know, that the economic viability for somebody is not necessarily the test. So I do completely accept what Councillor Fleming and Councillor Parker are saying, that there appears to be an interest in running this building as a pub. Whether or not they can make it run profitably is another matter. And I think I attach significant weight to the independent report from John here in considering that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Scorer.
Thank you, Chair. Being quite agricultural, it just comes down to two reasons for me. Does the village need a pub, or does it need another 6-bedroomed house? And I think that when it comes to viability of a pub, again, it all comes down to the landlord and who's running it. And so, you know, that you, as I've mentioned before, you're on the fringe of the AOMB. You're a stone's throw away from Morton in the Marsh. And I think that, you know, if it was a destination pub, I couldn't see why not. It would make a viable go. So, and I agree that with Councillor Fleming, that I would go against the officer's recommendations.
Thank you very much. Right, so I'm happy to let the debate continue, but I would point out at this juncture that we haven't had a proposal as of yet, so I will be looking for that, and that the reasons to go against the officer's recommendations need to be clarified for our officers so that if a proposal came, it could be substantiated. I'm just reminding you at that point. Mr. Jeffries?
Thank you, Chair. May I also add that any proposals contrary to the officer's recommendation, may they be policy-led. I think we're here not to determine whether or not we like this application. The job of the committee is to determine whether or not this application complies with planning policy that we've adopted.
Duly noted. Thank you very much. Anyone else like to go towards the debate? Otherwise, I'm going to have to push for proposals and seconders. Councillor Parker.
So just for clarity, I just want to say that the gentleman assigned to the task of identifying whether it was viable or not, I didn't mean to call into question any of that valuable work. Thank you.
Noted. Thank you very much. Councillor Harvey.
Can I just say that is meant to be made based upon evidence, not on expressions of hope or what I like. And I question the evidence. I question the evidence you can put forward to gainsay the assessment that's been provided by the independent assessor.
Thank you, Councillor Keith.
Thanks, Chair. Sorry.
Can I just finish that point up?
Do go on.
Because this committee has been in the past faced with decisions where evidence, assertions have been made during the meeting which have ended up not being held to be valid on appeal, and it has cost the council costs. Costs have been awarded against us. So the question is, have your view, but have your view based upon evidence.
Thank you very much. Councillor Keith.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chair. Right, well, this is a point I'm really making, if possible, to David in respect of policy issues. So is it the case, David, when I was explaining my sort of yes or no, is it the case that CS25 requires us to apply these criteria that there's no realistic prospect of it continuing? In there, does it mention economic prospect, or does it just say commercial prospect? And within there, can we confidently say that there have been expressions of interest from pub operators at whatever the price, that they would consider that they could make a realistic prospect of that facility continuing? So I'm focused on CS25-1, which says is the first test of the prospect, notwithstanding that it might not make sufficient economic profit for an investor. That's a separate issue. Can you clarify that? Did that make sense?
It did make sense, but I think my response would probably be that the commercial considerations of whether you buy a business or not and the economic considerations is semantics. That in actual fact, if something is commercially viable and economically viable, you're talking about the same thing. I think that the reasons someone might have made an offer to buy these properties are not entirely clear. They might not have been driven by an understanding that this would be a viable prospect. I think that Well, it's the opinion of the independent economic advisor on viability, which we've appointed. That's not an opinion made without reference to evidence.
Thank you, David. That's helpful. This is about commercial viability, isn't it? And whether or not someone would be prepared to invest in it. But what we have heard is that in respect of that commercial, you said semantics, but I think commercial and economic are slightly different, because the expert is looking at profitable returns for investment. Some people would see a commercial operation as something they could live in and accept a lifestyle from. Within that viability assessment, I think we've seen some evidence that the community have said they could come forward with something, and we've said that there's two recent offers that people are prepared to buy it and run it as a pub. Now, I don't see necessarily all the evidence in there, but I sense that there is no smoke without fire, and that there is some evidence out there that there are some offers, or have been made some offers on the table, which mean that there is a prospect of it continuing. I'm just thinking, I'm challenging the wording on that policy, because I know you need a policy hook for this, and it would need to be CS25, I think, because there's nothing really else. It's whether or not there's a realistic prospect or not. So that's what members need to consider.
Thank you. Okay, again, we haven't had a proposal as of yet. I'm going to have to start pushing members to start moving towards that. Councillor Fleming?
Okay, I'll make a proposal. I'm looking at section 11 in the officer's report, and it says, for the reasons set out in the principle of development, as a public house is not viable, and therefore the development accords with bullet point number 1 of CS25. We haven't proved that it's actually non-viable. We have opinions that it's not viable. So I'll hang my hat on CS25 and propose that we go against the officer's recommendation.
Thank you very much. Could you just clarify which aspect of CS25 for as specific as you can be, please?
I think basically we'll start off with paragraph 1 and see if we can build on that. You know, as far as I'm concerned, paragraph 1, there's no realistic prospect of the facility continue as a commercial or operational, you know, for operational reasons. That's what I would say. I think there is opportunities for the pub to do that if it gets the right people that actually can buy the thing.
Thank you. Councillor Keithley next.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Councillor Fleming. I'm going to be happy to second Councillor Fleming's proposal. And it is on the basis of CS25, this issue that there's no realistic prospect of the facility continuing for commercial and or operational reasons on that site. And I would say, like Councillor Fleming, that we've heard a lot of opinions on that, and differing opinions, but to my mind, it's not been proven.
Just reading this in a bit more detail, paragraph 2, I've just mentioned paragraph 1. Paragraph 2, it says the type of facility would be of benefit to the community, which is something else we can add in, and the facility can provide it effectively in an alternative manner. You know, so as far as I'm concerned, there's 1 or 2 items in there that I would be happy to go along with.
Thank you. Councillor Parker?
Thank you, Chair. So I think if we're picking from the list, and, you know, like a broken record, I'm going for number 2, because I don't think that the land has been actively marketed and in an appropriate manner, because because there were offers made that were realistic for the value as it currently stands, and that is, as I understand, how it should be interpreted.
Thank you very much. I'll wade into the debate myself at this point, just because I wanted to facilitate an open debate to try and gather the view of the committee. I'm falling in line with Councillor Fleming's view, but I want to clarify my thoughts along those lines. I think with regards CS 25.1, one of the crucial aspects of that for me is the use of a dash and or operational. I think what we have heard is that an operational aspect is an alternative to a commercial one, which can be seen as the economic aspect of it with regards to profit margins. Now, I think we have to be incredibly careful to specify that both reports that all three reports that we have had have been accepted as having sound methodologies which do represent an interpretation of the viability. One of the questions I asked of John was where the subjectivity aspect of that came into it, considering that we are objectively seeing different outcomes from those reports. He enlightened us to the fact that those are effectively the inputs. And it's fair to say that with regards to the economy of these things, those inputs can vary over time, and we do see that. I think that for my satisfaction, I'd say that that satisfies number one, not being an aspect that we can rely on to grant the application. With regards to item 2, in looking at the property being marketed, I am not satisfied that the timescale from now to the point at which it was marketed is comfortable within my mind, given the economic upheaval we have had nationally and internationally. It's fair to say that the markets, particularly with regards to mortgage rates and different aspects of the economy which do pertain to this, have had significant fluctuations, let's say, over the last 5 years. And I'd say that we would be potentially at risk of utilising that as a reason to grant this application, given the timescale since the last marketing exercise was carried out. To my mind, that satisfies that those 2 points are not met to allow for the principal development to be covered by CS 25. Now, that's how I interpret the policies that we have that have been accepted, and also gather the information that we've had as part of the consultations for this application. If Councillor Fleming, as the proposer, is happy to take on board those comments when forming your proposal, then I would be happy to support that proposal.
Yeah, we'll go with that.
Thank you. In which case, I'm just going to touch base with our officers to make sure that they have that down as reasonable reasons to go against the officer's recommendation.
I would just prompt members, you have at length talked a little bit about CS 25. There is also requirement under policy CS 22 in respect of the viability of the development. If members have reached a conclusion that there are opportunities and realistic prospects, and that they're not satisfied that the viability of the pub is unviable, then perhaps they may also wish to consider CS 22 in part of their reason, as that would be consistent.
Thank you. I think that's a particularly relevant point to raise, and I think one of the things that I'm glad that we facilitate through planning committees is hearing from members of the public and representations from local councillors and the like, and I think it's fair to say that we have had representations to that effect in addition to material ones that have been considered by the officers. So if, again, Councillor Fleming, you're happy to accept those as your reasons?
Yes, happy with that, thank you.
Shall I summarise the reasons?
If you could, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So to summarise, on the basis of what I've heard committees debate, having considered all the available evidence, including an independent viability assessment, It's concluded that there may be a realistic prospect of the facility continuing for commercial and or operational reasons. Members are mindful of the viability of the scheme and there having been offers made on the site. In respect of point 2 of CS25, members are mindful that the marketing was undertaken 5 years ago, and given the passage of time and the economic upheaval in the society at the moment, that they're not satisfied that it meets that criteria. The facility has not been evidenced to be able to be provided effectively in an alternative manner elsewhere, and there are no overriding environmental benefits of the proposal. Therefore, members conclude that the application conflicts with CS25 and CS22 of the core strategy.
Thank you. And that's accepted by a proposer and seconder. Jolly good. In which case we have a proposal which has been seconded to refuse the application for the reasons given. Can I see all those in favour, please?
That's 9, Chair.
And opposed?
1, Chair.
In which case committee resolves to refuse application 23/01922/FUL. We're now going to have a short adjournment to let the room clear and get the public gallery for the next items. Be back in 5 minutes, please. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to the public gallery for bearing with us for the first item. We'll move swiftly on then to our next item, which is application 23/03457/FUL, Burford Barn, Little Ulm, Wootton, Warren. Our presenting officer is Amy Flute. Once you're ready, feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Chairman. The application site is denoted by the black dot. It is within the open countryside, Greenbelt and Arden Special Landscape Area. The application site is edged red. The site is served by an existing access, and permission is sought for the demolition of a former barn and the erection of a dwelling house. The original barn is now being shown. This was a traditional red brick, single-storey cart shed. Permission was granted to allow the building to be converted under Class Q permission. The Class Q site layout on the left shows the extent of the Class Q approval. The building abutted the north-eastern boundary with a small residential curtilage to the east. The proposed site plan on the right shows a new building sited approximately 1 metre from the north-eastern boundary with a much larger residential curtilage to the west and east of the dwelling. As the building was demolished and this is a new building in the open countryside, the Class Q is not considered to be a fallback, but is shown for reference to the planning history. On the left, the Class Q approved floor plans and elevations can be seen, which approved a single-storey, two-bed dwelling with modest glazing to the existing openings. The original building measured approximately 18.1 metres in length, 4.9 metres in width and a height of 5 metres, 2.7 metres to the eaves. The rebuilt building on the right proposes a two-storey, two-bed dwelling with enlarged expanses of glazing, measuring approximately 19.1 metres in length, 5.4 metres in width and 5.9 metres in height, 3.5 metres to the eaves. This image is taken from within the site, from the access drive, looking in a westerly direction and shows the rebuilt barn. A patio can be seen in the foreground. Looking towards the site in a southeasterly direction, the barn's northern elevation can be seen. The larger rear patio can also be seen with the gabion wall as a result of changes to the land levels. Steps are also in place to the raised area, but it is my understanding that these are to be removed. This image is taken from the adjacent highway in a northerly direction. The boundary vegetation and the southern gable can be seen. And now a distant view from the highway looking towards the site in a northwesterly direction. That is the dwelling as it stands currently. Chairman, it is considered that the proposal results in a new dwelling in open countryside and is inappropriate development within the Greenbelt. The proposal encroaches into the open countryside and results in landscape harm and the loss of a traditional agricultural barn. There are no very special circumstances to outweigh the identified harm. Chairman, the recommendation is to refuse the application, subject for the reasons as detailed within the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Our first speaker is Councillor Kevin Haycock from Aston Cantlow Parish Council. Good evening, Councillor. You have 3 minutes. I'm happy to give you a 30-second warning before your time expires. It's the button on the right-hand side to turn on the microphone. And otherwise, once you're ready, take it away.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm chair of the Aston Cantlow Parish Council, who unanimously supported this planning application. I must first declare an interest in this application, as the applicant is known to me as a fellow member of the Parish Council, although they did not take part in any debate or vote in connection with the application. We sympathise with the approach taken by the planning officer in seeking to protect the open countryside and Greenbelt from inappropriate development. However, we consider that a more nuanced approach should be taken in this case. This is not a Captain Tom development where the applicant has obtained planning consent for one thing and then proceeded to construct something completely different with an adjoining gym and spa. The planning officer's report states that the building's footprint has been increased by 6%, although the applicant disputes this and maintains that the footprint is identical to the original barn. albeit that the building has been moved back slightly from the roadside hedge so that the foundations could be properly constructed and the roadside hedge be reinstated. The original red brick barn was in very poor condition and had no future for farming. Prior to any building or renovation, huge volumes of earth needed to be removed from within and around the barn in order to expose foundations. In total, 1.2 metres of earth were removed to expose the foundations, and a further 3 metres removed to allow sufficient foundations to comply with building regulations. To allow this, structural scaffolding was erected to support the building, but we are advised that during a storm, the gable end wall collapsed. The applicant therefore had no alternative other than to dismantle the remaining barn in stages so it could be properly rebuilt using the original materials. The house has the perception of a greater volume and height compared with the original barn, but this is because the surrounding earth has been removed, not by building additionally upwards or increasing the footprint. When viewed from the roadside compared with the original barn, there is no perception of harm to the openness of the green belt. The Parish Council have not received any complaints or representations concerning the building. The house has a high quality design. We consider that it looks like a barn conversion, complements the rural vernacular, and contributes to the parish identity and distinctiveness. It provides a valuable family home to the limited building stock in the parish. There are many good reasons to support this planning application, and I ask that you grant planning consent.
Thank you very much. Well within your time. Members, do we have any questions for our parish councillor? Councillor Hench-Serafin.
Okay, good evening. Do you know the date of when this new barn was built?
I believe that it was built some 4 years ago.
Oh, 2020. Thank you.
Any further questions? Councillor Ostrander?
Yeah, thank you for your comments. Can I go back to the observation about the gable end that was blown over in a storm? Are you suggesting that that gable end was rebuilt and incorporated in the new building? Or are you suggesting something else?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question.
Well, okay, so I'm asking this question because I think part of what we may need to decide as a committee is, was the building demolished or converted in terms of establishing whether it was a category Q type development. So you mentioned that the gable end was blown over and then you made a comment about it being rebuilt. Can you just take me back to that bit and explain what you meant about being rebuilt?
My understanding is that following the collapse of the gable end, it was not possible just to rebuild the gable end, and therefore piecemeal the barn had to be reconstructed using the original materials.
And so was any of that reconstruction, to your knowledge, incorporated in the new building that is located in the premises?
I haven't got that knowledge, but
okay,
I'm sure
thank you.
One of the other speakers will
Certainly,
have that,
thank you.
be able to answer that.
Thank you. Councillor Keithley next.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Councillor Haycock. Thank you for that presentation. A couple of questions, really. The first thing is, you mentioned, by the way, that it wasn't a Captain Tom development. Looks a little bit like one to me, given the size of the garden and the wall and the patio, I've got to say. Did you know that I'm sure I read the previous Class Q that was permitted, that's permitted development, different legislation, isn't it, Class Q, was objected to by the Parish Council. Can you explain why that would have been the case?
I was not on the Parish Council at the time. So
Were you aware it was objected to by the Parish Council?
No, I'm not.
Right, okay, thank you. Well, I'm not going to go into detail about that. I'm just going to ask you whether or not you knew that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Harvey.
Good evening, Councillor. I'm just concerned to understand what your understanding is about the size of the building. There's an assertion that the footprint is either 100% or 106%. That's marginal as far as I'm concerned. But the question of a two-storey building replacing a one-storey building strikes me as being a significant increase. Is that your understanding?
I'm not sure. I'm advised by the applicant that the size of the building is almost identical to that originally planned.
Any further questions for our parish council? I have a very quick one. Do you have a housing needs survey as part of your parish council that you're aware of?
We have, and one of my colleagues, one of my fellow speakers will be talking about that.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
We'll move on then to our next speakers. I have Andrew Murphy and Peter Walters, agent and applicant. Good evening, both. You have 3 minutes between you. I'm happy to give you a 30-second warning. How would you like to split
I'm going to be taking the whole 3 minutes.
Totally good. Okay. There is, when you're ready, take it away.
Thank you, Chairman. Class Q permitted development granted in 2018 allowed the change of use of a barn to a house. The applicant is a self-builder from the local area, and he began the barn conversion in good faith, despite the barn being in a poor state of repair. However, as the conversion continued, it evolved into a rebuilding project. 3 factors resulted in the original walls and roof being removed and rebuilt in stages. Firstly, a heavy storm in January 2020 caused the northern gable end wall to collapse. Secondly, roadside trees were harming the barn foundations. And thirdly, over many decades, earth had accumulated inside and around the barn. As required by the structural engineer and the building inspector, this earth was removed to find the bottom of the original brickwork to expose the original footings. The original walls were extraordinarily deep. The excavation successfully uncovered the original ground level of the barn, but at a cost of making the barn unstable despite scaffolding. Due to chronic instability, the barn walls were dismantled in stages and rebuilt adjacent to the original footprint, using the same bricks and tiles and located 1 metre further away from the trees. Please bear in mind that the height of the house compared to ordnance datum is the same as the original barn. It is the excavated earth that makes it appear taller and larger. Compared with the original barn, there has been no impact on the openness of the greenbelt. The committee report laments the loss of a traditional farm building. So does the applicant. However, as the works progressed, it became impossible to complete the barn conversion. And following the 2020 storm, the barn would have collapsed anyway. The design of the house is similar to the approved plans for the barn conversion. The committee report states that the garden has been extended into the open countryside. However, the rear garden is only 7 metres long. The garden sits on sunken ground, and the curtilage is the same size as the Class Q permission. The very special circumstances that apply in this case are as follows. Firstly, Class Q permitted development rights allowed the change of use of the barn to a house, and in that context, the replacement building does not result in an extra house on the site. Secondly, conversion works were successfully commenced, but unusual and compelling structural problems resulted in the barn being rebuilt. Thirdly, incorporating an air source heat pump, electric vehicle charging point, and planting 5,700 square metres of orchard and wildflower meadow are major environmental improvements compared to the consented Class Q barn conversion, which would have delivered none of that. Fourthly, the benefit of providing a self-build and family home in the parish with limited housing stock. In conclusion, there are strong material considerations that justify departure from the development plan, and so I ask you to grant planning permission.
Thank you very much. Members, do we have any questions for our agent and applicant? Councillor Harvey.
An obvious question for me would be, at the point where it was not possible to convert the original barn and the decision was taken to build a new building, did it occur to anybody to seek planning consent? Were there any discussions at that time?
Peter, do you want to answer that?
Yes, in the height of COVID, when most offices were shut, etc., we had on site in planning control the engineer, and we sought their advice of how to keep the building upright. Whilst the hardest part was complying with the building regulations at the hedge side, which was to do 3-metre deep foundations, whilst keeping a building standing upright and making sure that the workmen on site were safe. So we took a decision to essentially, we wanted to return the hedge into its original position, and we were basically impossibly sort of made to sort of make a decision to keep the building standing. That's why we paid a lot of money for a structural scaffold, and we kept going down, we kept finding more and more bricks. We've got a photo which we wanted to show of that, and that's the point we found ourselves in, where it was impossible almost to convert the building.
I think it's fair to say that the barn conversion was halfway through at that stage, and so the applicant was put in a very awkward position because the barn was becoming very unstable. It was a health and safety risk, and the building inspector recommended that he couldn't continue with the barn conversion, so he had to make a decision under fairly quick circumstances during the COVID years. So yes, I think with hindsight it might have been better to have made a planning application, but I think in the heat of the barn conversion, I think he was faced with a very awkward situation.
Thank you. Councillor Keithley.
Thank you very much. Oh, that's okay. Slight technical hitch. This is a question about the Class Q, really. Although, in my mind, I'm not sure why we're talking about the Class Q. But as I understand it, Class Q is a prior approval. It's not a planning application. It's a prior approval that you put forward with a certain amount of information that supports the conversion of a property to a dwelling. And that property you certify is capable of conversion when you make the prior approval application. So my question really relates back to what due diligence did you do in respect of the structural integrity of the barn that supported your application for the Class Q? Because as soon as you started to work on the barn, you realised that you got tree roots, you realised there was insufficient foundations, so your Class Q wouldn't have been valid, in my view, because there was too much work to do. One thing you omitted to say, I think, was the extent of works that you can do under a Class Q, and that's reasonable works in order to convert an existing building. So how do you square that?
I'll start off. There's a couple of things. Firstly, the applicant here was not the applicant for the Class Q, so he didn't make the application. He bought the site with the benefit of the Class Q permission. Secondly, that in order to undertake the barn conversion, it required a huge amount of excavation that I don't think could have been addressed properly at the time that the Class Q application was submitted. Did you want to come on that one, Peter, to say further?
I think we're a young couple that bought a plot of land with planning permission. You know, it's a project that we wanted to do a self-build in the local area. We took the project on with open arms, and then we discovered these problems. We bought the property in good faith that we could do a Class Q conversion, and we tried as hard as we could to get as close to the Class Q as we could, and we just came across problems. So that's why we employed a proper structural engineer, took advice from our builder, and that's what we ended up with.
Can I say one more thing, sir, if I may? It might help to answer the question if we see Appendix 4 of the planning statement. It's got photographs of the barn conversion as it was underway.
Just to come back on it, I empathise with the problem that you've maybe purchased a barn thinking you've got a planning permission, but you haven't. What you've got is Class Q prior approval, which requires you to convert a barn. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll leave it there. Any further questions, Councillor Fleming?
I think the guy from the Parish Council said this is a self-build. Is this something you're building to live in yourself? I heard you talk about builders, so you're obviously bringing contractors in to do certain jobs, but ultimately you're going to finish the job yourself and live in it. Is that correct?
Can I? Yeah, please. Sorry. There we go, mine's off yours.
We have been living in it and paying council tax for nearly 4 years. We intend to live here for the long term.
Okay, thank you. It's just a question I always ask on self-build.
Thank you.
Any further questions for our applicant and agent? No, in which case, thank you very much for your contribution. Okay, we move on to our final speaker, Ward Member Councillor Holmes. Good evening, Councillor. So you have 5 minutes. Have to give you a 30-second warning. Otherwise, when you're ready, take it away.
Thank you very much. It's rare for this committee to see a planning application with both unanimous support from both the Parish Council and local residents. There were 15 letters of support and no local objections. Having heard what's been presented so far this evening, I hope you can agree that this application is an unusual case. Paragraph 12 of the MPPF states that local planning authorities may take decisions that depart from an up-to-date development plan, but only if material considerations in a particular case indicate that the plan should not be followed. In this case, there are compelling material considerations. This local planning authority has occasionally granted planning permission for the construction of a new house due to a Class Q permitted development right fallback position, including sites in the green belt. In this case, the 2018 Class Q consent allowed the development of a house, and in that context, the number of houses is unchanged with this application. The applicant attempted a genuine barn conversion, but was beset by structural problems and has been penalised for not applying for planning permission for a rebuild before he started work on the conversion. The second issue is that many of the structural calamities that caused the project to change direction from a barn conversion to a rebuild. And these were, one, the necessity to excavate farm waste and expose the original barn's walls and foundations. Unfortunately, it was this excavation destabilised the barn. 2, the root damage caused by the adjacent roadside hedge. And 3, the great storm on January 2020 that caused partial collapse of the already weakened barn. I am satisfied that the applicant has made a genuine attempt to undertake the barn conversion. In order to solve the structural problems, he took advice from a structural engineer, building inspector, to progressively rebuild the barn walls in the style and proportions of the original barn. This has been successfully achieved, as the original structure's design features and materials have all been preserved. Page 45 of the committee report refers to the original barn being a non-designated heritage asset, and the 5th paragraph says, these factors would have been worthy of consideration as a non-designated heritage asset. The report goes on to treat this barn as such and uses this as one of the reasons for refusal. However, the barn was not on any list and is given its poor condition, it should not be registered as a heritage asset. Next, I believe that there has been no harm to the openness of the green belt through this development. The officer's report on page 44 claims that the barn's height has increased, but this is inaccurate. Ground was excavated to restore the barn, removing decades of build-up, farm waste and earth. This excavation exposed parts of the exterior walls that were previously buried, creating the illusion of a taller structure. The unlevelness of the barn at each end that were shown in the images there supports this. And the officer's report claims that there's been a 6% increase in the building's footprint, but I'm not convinced that it is larger from the original barn. The Class Q plans that they quote lacked any scaled measurement, so I question how precise the figures were that they came to. So, there are several benefits to this development to take into account. 1, it's a good design with an attractive barn vernacular that maintains the character of the original barn and the parish. 2, it delivers an air source heat pump and higher levels of insulation that would not have been achieved if the barn had just been converted. 3, it's a self-build development of which the district has a shortfall. 4, it delivers a valuable family home to the parish, where the 2019 Aston Cantlow Housing Needs Survey identifies a need for 2- and 3-bed owner-occupied houses. And then 5, the substantial landscaping and biodiversity net gain enhancements by virtue of planting large wildflower meadows and orchards across the rest of the field. So quickly in summary, in terms of the Greenbelt policy and other policies relating to the countryside, there were very special circumstances that justify departure from the development plan, and these circumstances will not set a precedent for future applications. The circumstances fall into 3 categories. 1, the context of the Class Q permitted development right for a barn conversion. 2, the unforeseen structural problems that arose during the barn conversion. And 3, the many benefits of a new, needed family home and associated biodiversity net gain. The proposal has the full support of the local community, and I ask you to grant this planning permission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Well within your time. Members, do we have any questions for our ward member? Nothing forthcoming, in which case thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you very much.
Right, we can move on then to points of clarification from our officers. Any points of clarification, Councillor Keithley?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, quick point of clarification on Class Q being a fallback in this particular case. Could Amy perhaps clarify that for us now that the barn is effectively demolished and a new building is in its place?
Okay. So in officer view, the Class Q isn't a fallback because we no longer have the existing building. A new building has been built. So in order for the Class Q to have been a realistic fallback, it would have needed to have been the existing building that stood, because that's what the Class Q permission was relative to.
Oh, Councillor Scorer.
Thank you, Chair. In the officer's opinion, I think it's ground level, isn't it? I'm looking at the plans. How much higher is it from the existing? And I know that they're saying that the soil has moved in from the old barn, but in your opinion, how much higher is it than the old barn?
So I don't know. There's no land level drawings, obviously, to show the actual datum land levels, but I can show you these pictures. So the image on the bottom was taken in 2017, and that was the original barn as stood when we assessed the Class Q. And if we move down to this building, this image here, you can see the level of excavation that has taken place by the gabion wall. That would be how I would view the difference in land levels between the two pictures of time. And this is the new building as built.
So I'm sure I've interpreted that correctly. You're saying that what effectively is a sort of a ha-ha, the upper level on the right-hand side, was actually the level upon which the original barn stood. Is that correct?
From the information that has been submitted, that would be my understanding from when looking at this image here of the barn in 2017. And as you can see at the back of the barn here, it was relatively flat, the land, the level of the ground level of the existing barn. By comparison to now, you can see in this photo where there's some land level changes, and to the rear of the building, you can clearly see a change in land level.
So somebody's had their bucket and spade out.
Councillor Parker?
Yeah, I'd like to just get some advice on when taking on a Class Q. I guess from time to time, things don't always quite work out as you might hope. And could you just kind of lay out the process that you would see as being appropriate under the circumstances you've heard? What I'm wanting to get to is how divergent the process that has taken place is from the process that might have happened in a perfect world. Thank you.
So you have to carry out your Class Q in accordance with the regulations. So it has to be a conversion of an existing building and follow the strict guidance. The guidance is clear that work should be reasonably necessary to facilitate the conversion and are effectively limited work so that the building maintains its character. In this case, we have a completely new building. The building has been resited by comparison to the footprint of the original Class Q. So the Class Q is no longer valid. So if the Class Q were to be valid, we would need to be looking at the original building as stood and considering what the works were by comparison to what was originally submitted.
Sorry, what I'm looking for is what is the process in a perfect world that should have been followed when that windy night in January 2020 came along. What should have, I guess, gone from there? Thank you.
At the point that the applicant developer realised that they had a structurally unsound building, they no longer benefited from Class Q because it wasn't capable of conversion into a dwelling. At that point, without a Class Q, they should have stopped and come for planning permission to redevelop their site. At that point, in an ideal world, we would have been able to determine it based on policies, as we will do tonight, which...
Okay, thank you, Dave. Would that mean it would be on the original footprint?
I mean, they would be able to make any application which they chose, because they wouldn't benefit from any Class Q. There would be no extant consent via prior approval or otherwise for a dwelling on this site.
Okay, thank you.
And that is where we are now. There is no extant permission or prior approval for a dwelling on this site. We're looking at a barn that has been demolished and a wholly new structure erected in its place.
Councillor Scorer?
Thank you, Chairman. I'm just looking at, from a fortnight ago when we were looking at hen houses and Class Q and fallback on that. Is the difference here with your refusal because it's in the Greenbelt?
I'm not aware of the application you are referring to, but for this application, the Class Q isn't a fallback because we're not looking at that building that was assessed under the Class Q. We are looking at this as a new building within the Greenbelt.
Councillor Keithley?
Only a point of clarification on the garden. The applicant suggested that the curtilage was the same as the original queue. And I know that we've said the queue doesn't exist effectively, but I'd be interested to see your explanation of what's become the residential curtilage. I think under queue, the curtilage is the same as the area of the building.
Correct. So on the Class Q, the curtilage can't be any larger than the size of the footprint of the existing building. So on the left, the Class Q curtilage is shown. On this plan, it's this line around here, which is showing the residential curtilage, which in my view is larger. I haven't measured it, but it would appear so. But also from going to site, there's a patio sitting out area here, and it certainly suggests from going on site that the area around the building which is being used is certainly a lot larger than by comparison in size to the Class Q.
Thank you for that clarification.
Councillor Harvey?
Are there any constraints, and if there are, on our interpretation of special circumstances, what are they?
So the NPPF provides that in some circumstances you may depart from or you may allow what is essentially inappropriate development in the green belt. You must be satisfied that very special circumstances exist, and they will not exist unless the circumstances are such that they outweigh all the harm by virtue of harm to the openness of the green belt and any other harm you might find. There is some broad interpretation of what may amount to a very special circumstance, but it would have to be planning related. The weight which you must afford harm to the green belt is very significant, so it would have to be substantial public benefits or other benefits, planning gain essentially, which in members' mind very clearly outweighed the harm of in this case a new building in the green belt.
Any other points of clarification? No, in which case we can move to debate. Who would like to start? Councillor Keithley.
Thank you, Chair. Right, my thoughts on this. I do empathise with the situation the applicant finds himself in. He's bought something in good faith, and he hasn't been able to develop the Class Q, and he finds himself in a very difficult situation. I don't see special circumstances, unfortunately. Class Q is very specific. It is a prior approval under different legislation. It's not a planning permission. The existing building has to be converted, and it has to be converted with a reasonable amount of works. And it's actually vital that anybody coming forward with Class Q makes an honest assessment when they're applying for a Q of the state of the building to be absolutely certain it can be converted. So my view at the moment is that there are many, many policy issues why a brand new building in open countryside is not to be permitted under our policies. And I think if we went against the officer's recommendation, my view is that it would open the floodgates to all sorts of barns being knocked down all over the place.
Councillor Ostrander.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic. I can see all sides of this. I think, unfortunately, the requirements for Class Q have certainly not been met, in my opinion. I do also, though, from my own experience, know that gaining advice on planning, etc., during COVID would be challenging. So that might be worth considering in terms of some of the decision making that was taken at the time. I think probably for me this is going to come down to deciding whether the very special circumstances put forward are adequate to allow development in the green belt.
Thank you. Councillor Harvey.
I'm sympathetic to this application because the applicant wasn't the applicant for the Class Q. Class Q consent was given. I think he was entitled to rely upon that when he bought the property. The problems that he's found were not of his making. They were caused by the state of the barn and the weather. He has reused the existing materials from the demolished barn in the new building. The new building is, in terms of footprint, in my terms, within a smidgen of the original. The difference in height, I think, is minimal. It's not offensive to my eye, anyway. The application has broad local support. The new building replaces one building in the Greenbelt with another in the Greenbelt, which is similar in style. I know that had the application come forward on the basis of a new application in the open countryside, in the Greenbelt, the chances of it gaining approval would not be high. However, that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with somebody who bought a property in certain circumstances, in good faith, had a go, found he got problems. He should have applied for consent when he found he did have problems he couldn't overcome. But given where we are, it strikes me that common sense says that the world is no worse off if that building, the new building, is allowed to stay. And I think these are exceptional circumstances, an exceptional combination of circumstances, not of his making, and he's dealt with it as best he thought he could at the time, although in my sense slightly misguided. But nevertheless, I am of the opinion that this is a reasonable application to be approved, and I'm minded to go against the officer's recommendation in this particular case.
Thank you. Councillor Parker.
So, yeah, Councillor Harvey was very eloquent, and he said everything that I would have liked to have voiced, but more eloquently. But I wasn't going to say any of that because I don't think it moves the dial, and I want to find something that does genuinely move the dial. I don't think those things are special circumstances, although I'd like them to be. And if enough of us do think they are special circumstances, I could support it.
I might have mentioned that there were environmental benefits in the new proposal that weren't there in the Class Q case, which have to be weighed in the balance to the application's favour.
Councillor Parker.
I will very briefly to come back on that. I thought the same, and frankly, I thought perhaps Class Q is in need of a breath of fresh air, because Class Q doesn't allow you to build, potentially, it hinders building net zero homes in terms of energy consumption.
Councillor Henry.
Okay, thank you. I've read this application about 5 times, and I do agree with the officer's report on this. This goes against nearly all our policies, and I think if this gets passed, it would set a precedence, and you'd have barns being knocked down everywhere, and then just go in and build them whenever you like. I think this is not appropriate. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to contribute to the debate?
Well, if I might add, Whilst I heard what Councillor Harvey and Councillor Parker said, and have some sympathy for your position, the development of the original Class Q would have kept a very small curtilage and the barn would have looked like the barn. What's actually happened is something much bigger has been built, 2-storey, and the residential development around that barn is significantly bigger than it would have been had the Class Q been adhered to. And the reason the Class Q exists is to protect what is in that open countryside, to keep it looking like it is. In my view, it doesn't look anything like that. The residential paraphernalia that grows around a building makes it look really quite different to what had been before. And one has to ask, given the opportunity to rebuild, why wasn't it rebuilt in the style of the Class Q? Why was something else built in its stead?
Thank you. We haven't, as of yet, had a proposal, and I'm going to have to be seeking that. Councillor Keith.
Well, I think I'd make a proposal that we stick with the officer's recommendation. They've laid out a very, very firm case for all the policy reasons why a new building in the open countryside is against our policies. I don't need to add any more because the case is very, very clearly met. Empathise with the applicant, sure, but our planning policies matter a great deal in open countryside. And if we go against the officer's recommendation, you are setting a very, very dangerous precedent for barns that get Class Q to be knocked down and something else built in their place. That's my concern. So I would make a proposal to stick with the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. Councillor Hench-Serafin.
I'll second that proposal for Councillor Keithley.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to contribute to the debate at this point? I know we've had a range of views expressed, but we only have one proposal as of yet, which has been seconded. If not, in which case we'll move to the vote. Okay, we have a proposal to refuse the application in line with the officer's recommendations. Can I see all those in favour, please? And opposed?
Chairman.
Opposed? In which case, committee resolves to refuse application 23/03457/FUL.
Chair.
Okay, members, we have one more item on the agenda and it's 8:30 or nearing 8:30, in which case we are at risk of going over the 3-hour mark. So I'd like to just at this point ask whether we are happy to do that for the final application. Yeah, agreed. Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. In which case we'll move on to our final application, item 5, application 24/01171/Vary, Spire View Garden, Saffron Meadow, Stratford-on-Avon. Amy Flute is again our presenting officer. When you're ready, take it away.
Thank you, Chairman. The application site is denoted by the black dot. It's within the built-up area boundary of Stratford. The application site is edged red. The site is served by a highway access from Saffron Meadow to the south and a pedestrian access from Mill Lane to the north. The conservation area boundary is to the north and south, and part of the site is outside of this boundary. Significant listed buildings adjoin the site, which are in red, with Grade 1 Holy Trinity Church to the northeast. The principle of development has previously been approved after much discussion about the design, and there were various applications. The approved site layout is being shown on the left. This proposal seeks to vary conditions to change plot design, materials, fenestration, building heights, layout, and landscaping. The approved elevations for plot 1 can be seen on the left. The dwelling was 2-storey, approximately 6 metres high. Green walls, to the north and east first floor elevations, Renea zinc to other first floor elevations, and blue lias stone to the ground floor. The proposed elevations, which are for consideration, are on the right-hand side. These show the removal of green walls at the first floor and a replacement with a Rian Eco Zinc to all elevations and red brick to the ground floor. The height has been increased to 6.5 metres. The floor plans can now be seen. The proposal relocates the massing at first floor, as you can see here, and links the garages at ground floor. Plot 2's existing and proposed elevations can now be seen. Again, the proposal results in the loss of green walls to the north and east elevation, with the first floor being constructed entirely from Rian zinc, and the ground floor is to be red brick instead of lias. The height again increased to 6.5 metres. Similarly, for the floor plans for plot 2 will also change the massing arrangement at first floor and link the garages at ground floor. The left image shows the access into the site from Saffron Meadow, looking in a northerly direction, and the right image is from within the site, looking towards the Saffron Meadow access in a southerly direction. This image is taken from within the site, looking in a northeasterly direction. Grade 1 Holy Trinity Church, Grade 2 Solly House, and the Trinity Street dwellings, which are also listed, can be seen, as well as the adjoining dwelling, Avonfield. This is a panoramic of the site, so starting at the west boundary, moving to the northern boundary with Trinity Street, and then east views of the church and Solly House, returning to the south with Saffron Meadow. This view is taken looking in a southwesterly direction back towards the vehicular access, so this is at the point where you would access the pedestrian walkway. And finally, the left image shows views from Mill Lane across Avonfield in a southwesterly direction. The site's approximately here. And the right image is the pedestrian access gate, which serves the site from Mill Lane, which was secured as part of the original consent. Chairman, it is considered that the proposed variations being sought diminish the design and result in harm to heritage assets with no public benefit to outweigh the identified harm. And it is recommended to refuse the application subject to the reasons detailed in the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm actually going to call a very brief adjournment just so I can have a conversation with one of my members, and then we'll come straight back. Bear with me. Thank you. Apologies for that. I've just realised, unbeknownst to me before right now, that I have a potential conflict of interest on this application, in being that I have a professional relationship with the architect. I did not realise that until I checked the speakers list. As such, I'm going to step down from the chair, and I'm going to seek nominations for a chair to take over, if possible. Councillor Holmes. Okay. Yeah, so I think that was proposed by Councillor Keithley and seconded by Councillor Holmes, in which case Councillor Keithley is going to take the chair. Apologies. Can we please vote on that? Agreed. Thank you.
Thank you. I've just been asked to check whether or not there are any other nominations for the chair of this item. If anybody would like to step in place of me, please step forward. I take that as no. There are. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay, so right, so I've been caught out a little bit. I was sort of starting to fall asleep there. So we're on application reference 24 01171/vary. We've heard from the case officer. Thank you, Sue. And I'd like to call the first speaker, who is Andrew Murphy, the planning agent. If you'd like to step forward, Mr. Murphy, thank you very much. As usual, you have 3 minutes.
There are others on the speakers list who may well answer questions.
Oh, I see. I've got that now. Thank you very much.
They can come up if they're called.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. So I'll give you 3 minutes. If you'd like a warning about 30 seconds in, I'll wave my hand.
I'm okay on 3 minutes.
Okay, super. Okay, so take it away when you're ready.
Planning permission was granted in 2020 to build 2 houses in a garden, and the development has commenced. The approved scheme is a high-quality contemporary design. The planning officer thinks the amended scheme is not as good as the approved scheme. We disagree and regard the amendment is better when all the dimensions of sustainability are taken into account. This amended scheme is also high quality and it deserves to be granted on its own merits. The key changes are as follows. Firstly, at ground floor, a change from lias stone to red brick. Lias stone is no longer quarried locally, the nearest quarry being in Dorset, and Dorset lias has a different colour to the historic lias found in Stratford district. Furthermore, red brick is in keeping with the locality. Secondly, at first floor, a change in the type of zinc cladding. The approved zinc is only made in Texas and would have resulted in a large carbon footprint to import. The proposed alternative zinc cladding is European, and it has a dark grey weathered appearance, resonating with local slate roofs and the lead roof of Holy Trinity Church. Thirdly, the addition of solar panels on the roof. Fourthly, an increase in building height by 37 centimetres in order to screen the solar panels. Fifth, a revised floor plan and windows. Sixth, the removal of green walls. Seventh and finally, amended landscaping to include new tree planting along the boundaries. In many respects, the proposed amendment is similar to the approved, and it retains its bold contemporary aesthetic. The location, footprint and floor space are largely unchanged, and whilst the first floor of each house has been reversed, the first floor volume is similar. The primary goal of this application is to respond positively to mitigating climate change. Since the previous scheme was granted in 2020, building regulations require greater thermal efficiency, and the Council has published an SPD on climate change adaptation. The proposed materials have a reduced carbon footprint than the approved materials. Green walls are unnecessary given that solar panels and the change in materials make the development net zero for operational energy. The proposed houses are not located in a conservation area. It is a garden surrounded by large houses. The proposed design and massing is sensitive to the setting of neighbouring listed buildings.
30 seconds now.
In conclusion, the amended scheme responds directly to the impacts of climate change and represents a positive design evolution. It complies with all the relevant development plan policies listed in the committee report, and therefore we recommend that planning permission is granted. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's well within your time as it happens, so I'll just stop there. Members, do you have any questions for Mr. Murphy, the planning agent? Yes, Councillor Harvey.
Just a straightforward question about Texas. In the original application, did you know that that material only came from Texas?
Yeah, thank you.
So the question was about Texas.
Yeah, so the original application was made, or it was granted in 2020, but the application was made by Mr. and Mrs. Hicks. We bought the consented site from Mr. and Mrs. Hicks in December 2021. So as soon as we looked at the original application, we did the analysis and knew that the Ruano zinc was solely made in the US and therefore was of high carbon content. Does that answer your question?
Well, I don't know. I'm trying to establish whether at the time the application was made and the the Texan zinc was specified as part of the application. I presume that was it known at that time?
I would guess it was, but you'd have to ask people who were involved at the time. But a key change since February 2020, when the site was consented, is that is both the SPD and the building regulations. So at the time, people might have said, well, it's made in Texas, fine. But that's not consistent with the SPD.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. Does that answer your question? Thank you. And Councillor Organ, would you like to ask a question, please?
Thank you, Chairman. Can you confirm whether there are any other changes to the original application than those that you have pointed out verbally at this meeting?
As far as I'm concerned, that list that I read earlier are the only changes. It's a summary, but it is the only changes made to the original scheme.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Councillor Parker.
Thank you. So I was just wanting to understand, obviously, not importing from the US and not dragging stone up from the south of England is a good thing. Was that the motivation, or was the motivation because the new look, the bold look, the even bolder look, perhaps, is what is desired?
Simon, I'm going to ask Simon to answer that. He's the architect.
Okay, so there are a number of criteria. Clearly, we were working with an existing consent, but our client had a fundamentally different approach in that they were looking for a net zero carbon home, and that simply wasn't possible with the approved scheme. Not least due to the introduction of Part O of the building regulations that deals with building overheating. The existing scheme, the approved scheme, predated the introduction of Part O and simply doesn't work. It would not comply with building regulations currently. In terms of, sorry, you asked me about architectural approach as well as
Thank you. Really, what I want to understand was the motivation for the change. That's all.
I think the simple motivation. Sorry.
Net zero.
Net zero and a contemporary home that was appropriate in terms of materials for the locality.
So can I just give a little bit of context? So we've lived here in Stratford district for 25 years. I've worked in the energy industry for all of that time. And I've seen the challenge of hitting net zero. We wanted to move into Stratford for our retirement, and we wanted to build a home that was net zero in operation through insulation and through
Thank you.
solar panels.
Could I just ask if you just respond to the question more precisely, please, rather than a speech in that respect? I think you're saying that you've been focused on net zero. Thank you very much. Councillors, any further questions? Because I have Councillor Ostrander. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for all of these clarifications. So I think your desire to have a net zero home is laudable. I think that's great, and I know the whole council would be probably behind you on that. However, I just want to check. So one of the issues seems to me the use of just zinc for the first floor. The original proposal suggested some green walls. So I just wondered if someone could, well, I guess my question is, in order to achieve net zero or reduce your carbon imprint as much as possible, do you need to have all of the walls on the first floor made of this European zinc? That would be one question I have.
Well, I guess one could have incorporated the green walls, but there's a couple of points on that. They're not required to establish a net zero home in this case, and the green walls cannot be seen from any public vantage point, and that's due to the revisions to the landscaping. So the green walls don't contribute to the wider context.
Okay, so another question then. So you've altered the, made it handed, the upstairs, the first floor. So you've altered the layout of the first floor. Because in the original, it seemed, the original plans, it seemed that the green walls would be visible. Is that true? From
The revised landscaping and tree planting along the boundaries has meant that those green walls would not now be visible.
But would they have been in the original
Yes, I beg your pardon.
layout?
Yes, yes.
So, okay, so that leads to another question, if I'm allowed. Yes?
Yes, please carry
So
on.
can you explain why you have changed the upper floor, the first floor? Is that something to do with, again, carbon savings? Or is that simply an aesthetic?
Well, it's as much to do with a choice of materials that actually reflects the locality. Roano zinc is a...
Sorry, I'm not talking about the zinc. I'm talking about the actual arrangement of that first floor, making it handed.
Oh, well, this is more of a client requirement of space planning. Sorry, I beg your pardon. In terms of handing the planning, yes.
Yes. So changing... Right.
The change of the handing was a residential amenity point.
Right, thank you. Councillor Ostrander, does that answer your question?
So it's an aesthetic, as opposed to an energy-saving need.
Right. Councillor Ostrander, does that answer your question?
I'll take it.
Thank you very much. Anybody else like to ask a question, councillors? Before I ask a question myself, if that's okay. What I wanted to know is whether or not you had any comments to make regarding the Conservation Officer's report. And I should just read you that. The standardisation of the cladding and use of light, a grey colour, diminishes the architectural contribution, creates a more monolithic type massing arrangement. The effect will have a discordant, domineering appearance within the setting of the designated heritage assets. I'm interested to know what conversations you've had with the Conservation Area Officer on these points.
I'll start off and then hand over to Simon, the architect. In terms of the first floor, it's still zinc. So the original material is zinc and the revised material is still zinc. So the amount of zinc is still the same. It's just a different type of zinc. It's more efficient in terms of embodied carbon type of material. In terms of conversations with the Conservation Officer, there haven't been any conversations with the Conservation Officer. We have a difference of opinion with the Conservation Officer. But again, I emphasise the site's not in a conservation area. And it's not a site with a listed building on it.
Yeah, thank you for that answer, Mr. Murphy. If there are any further questions, no further questions, I thank you all very much for your contribution. Thank you very much indeed. And our next speaker is Councillor Fradgley. Good evening, Councillor. Thank you very much. I think you know the routine, having been here before a few times, and you have 5 minutes. So I'll start your... Well, you need all 5.
Just about.
Well, I'll start the clock,
Yeah.
and I'll let you know as you get near to it. Okay.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you.
I was involved in the discussions to approve the 2019 application for the 2 houses on this site. And at the time, I was not aware of any detailed consideration of climate change and moves towards that position. And I've supported the requests of the new applicant to modify these homes to build as close to passive house standard as possible, and to the highest standards in line with SDC aspiration to build for a changing future with minimum impact on the environment. Sorry, I've got a bit of that. I understand that the agreed development, if submitted today, would not comply with the expected standards on sustainability as set out in SPD Part 5, adopted on July 2020, or Building Regulations Part O, overheating published in December 2021. For example, the SDP states the new development should use sustainable materials as well as those that have been locally sourced, and therefore reduce the carbon footprint both during construction and over its lifetime, and development should ensure that they are well designed in order to minimise overheating. The changes requested are all concerned with reducing impact on the environment while maintaining a building of similar footprint, similar mass and bulk. Essential increase in insulation and roof solar panels will increase the height by 0.5 metre. On this large plot, this increase has minimal impact on surrounding buildings and marginally increases the glimpse of the house from Mill Lane. However, increasing tree planting here will minimise any marginal impact. It is proposed by the applicant that these trees should be a line of pleached trees growing to the height of 6 to 7 metres, of appropriate species for longevity and climate change and supporting biodiversity. The changes to fenestration are to reduce heat loss, to achieve passive house standards and to comply with building regulations as already stated, Part A. The total area of fenestration needed to be reduced quite significantly to meet these targets, and the layout of the windows amended to fit the internal layout and the vertical rhythm. The Roano zinc agreed in the first iteration is sourced from America, and I understand is a novel material to this country, while the proposed Ryan Eco Zinc comes from Europe with a lower carbon footprint, both in manufacture and travel. The Roano zinc is produced in Scandinavia and uses renewable electricity. It has half the embedded carbon as ordinary zinc. This applicant has not identified such a zinc production in the UK. Changing to a local brick reduces the carbon embedded in Lias wall construction and relates to the surrounding buildings, Chapel House, Soley House and Trinity Street. Lias stone is material found more often in the town centre. The removal of the green wall in favour of trees enhances the sustainability of this house. Proposed trees will capture and store considerably more CO2 with less maintenance and water use than a green wall. Quality of construction can be ensured by looking at the access path already constructed. There have been no objections from residents or statutory consentees. I understand that both Chapel House, Solly House and residents of Saffron Lodge at the entrance to the site are happy with the changes. The argument comes down, do these thoughtful changes to make the house fit for a changing climate and in the spirit of SDC climate change aspirations, weigh the argument in favour of granting approval of the variances requested, or does the subjective views about design expressed in the planning papers persuade this committee to refuse this eminently sustainable house, which will comfortably sit within a very large plot, well landscaped and surrounded by vernacular brick properties? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Fradgley. Well within your time. Councillors, do you have any questions for Councillor Fradgley? None? I'm surprised. Councillor Holmes? No? Thank you very much, Councillor Fradgley. Okay, so we can now move on to questions of clarification to the planning officers. I can see three hands up. Okay, let me just make a note. That was Councillor Harvey first, Councillor Harvey, and then Councillor Holmes and Councillor Parker. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you. There is a line in your report on page 57 which says, I don't consider that the environmental benefits outweigh the design harm in this instance. Two questions. One is, from the speakers we've heard from, is there any information that they provided that you had not already taken into account? That's one question. And the second question is, could you identify, we've been presented by one of the speakers with a list of changes that are being made. As presented, they're just seven, I think it was 7 items, and they all weigh equally because they've been verbalised in that way. But I don't know how to evaluate them in terms of which is more important or which is very, very limited impact or whatever. So in answering the question, could you identify the changes which are being proposed, which you think are present the largest harms? I'm trying to get some sort of feel for the basis of your objections?
So all of the information which has been submitted by the applicant has been taken into account with regards to the ways in which they are trying to improve the sustainability of this scheme. I think the original scheme was never submitted as a passive house, and obviously that's why it has been designed in such a way. By comparison, now we're trying to take a consented scheme that wasn't designed as a passive house and turn that into a passive house. And in doing so, the changes which are being made, which are listed within the report, so that's the redesign of the ground and first floor layouts, the change of the first floor cladding to from Renault zinc to the Rian zinc, the total loss of blue lias, the removal of green walls, the increase in height. That in doing that is diminishing the design from where the original scheme was going. I think the conservation officer's comments point out really quite precisely how the changes to design to try and achieve the environmental benefits, the impact that in doing that, changing the materials, changing the massing, has on the heritage assets and the harm that arises as a result of doing so.
Thank you. I would perhaps sum up by saying this is a larger dwelling, or a larger pair of dwellings. I've made the same mistake. A number of people have referred to this as a single dwelling, but it's actually a pair of dwellings. They are larger dwellings, more monolithic in basic materials compared to the original proposal, with worse fenestration, frankly, and the elevation facing the Trinity Church has been altered from a green wall to something far more rudimentary in officers' view.
Could I ask a supplementary question? Simple question of fact. The assertion was made that this proposed development, does not lie in the conservation area. The paper says that it partly does lie in the conservation area. Which statement is correct?
So the pedestrian access is within the conservation area, which does form part of the application site. And then the position of the two dwellings is outside of the conservation area, but obviously adjacent to.
Satisfied with that? Councillor Harvey. Right, next on the list was Councillor Holmes. I invite you to ask your question.
Thank you, Chair. So looking at some of the language used in the report, like dominant, overbearing, stark, poorer, less sensitive, less attractive, seems like quite emotive language that doesn't seem appropriate for what we've been presented with. To what extent is this just the personal views of officers, and taste, rather than looking at material planning reasons?
So those comments speak to policy CS9 of the core strategy, which talk about design, talk about overbearing and overshadowing, make comments about materials and design quality. The comments are the professional views of your appointed planning officers and the conservation officer. The views of the conservation officer are supported by your planning officers. There's a unanimity of consideration there, which suggests that although some matters are subjective, design overall and high quality design can be achieved.
In addition to that, I would also draw your attention to the MPPF. So paragraph 135 of the PPF states that planning decisions should ensure that the developments are visually attractive as a result of good architecture, layout and appropriate and effective landscaping, are sympathetic to local character and history, including the surrounding built environment and landscape. Furthermore, paragraph 140 of the MPPF states that local planning authorities should also seek to ensure that the quality of approved development is not materially diminished between permission and completion as a result of changes being made to the permitted scheme, for example, through changes to approved details such as materials used.
Does that answer your question, Councillor Holmes? In which case, I'd invite Councillor Parker next to ask his question.
Yes, thank you. I think mine has been addressed, and apologies if it comes again. I just want very specifically under the conservation comments on page 55, it says this will neither preserve or enhance the conservation area or the context to the listed buildings. And I just want again to understand what this has to do with the is it that if you can see it from the conservation area it matters, or does it only matter if the building itself is in the conservation area? And I appreciate it's two buildings, one may be in and one may be out kind of thing. I know, well, we see it in front of us here.
It's the perception, so we have to consider views into and out of the conservation area, the character, the feel. So obviously there are many factors which contribute to the character of a conservation area and also the setting of listed buildings.
I think as well it's important to understand the position of this site within the district and within the town itself. Amy mentioned in the previous application a great deal of effort was made to ensure that the design was right, the motivation for that being that this is one of the last vestiges of green open space between the Holy Trinity Church and the open countryside. That is a matter which was of considerable concern to the conservation officer when dealing with the original application, and this design came forward as very carefully thought out, and officer's view is that this diminishes the design.
Councillor Organ, please, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, Chair. Can you tell me, please, in your opinion, is this change in design the only way to achieve the environmental benefits?
So, in my opinion, we've been presented with this scheme. There was a previous scheme that was withdrawn, which was also looking for passive house standards. That did still include green walls at first floor, for example. So there may be other examples which could maintain design elements and obviously achieve a passive house standard. The applicants haven't engaged in pre-app with us, so we're sort of unaware of other examples that there may be.
Thank you.
There's no evidence that this is the only way to achieve a passive house standard on this site.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Organ. Are there any further questions? Just looking round, just in case I missed somebody. No. Okay, in which case that means we can move on to the debate. So would somebody like to kick us off with that? And Councillor Holmes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. I think looking on balance at the application with what's been presented, I think it was helpful, the applicants going through the changes and the differences. And I think on balance with the solar, them describing the reasons for changing materials, and it's nice to hear that their prime motivation for these changes is to achieve a net zero home. And I think we as an authority need to commend that. In terms of the design, I don't think that this application is in contrary to policies CS8 or CS5. I think that both are visually attractive and sympathetic, and I think they both successfully seek to ensure quality is not diminished. So as such, I would like to propose that we grant the application against officer's recommendations.
Thank you, Councillor Holmes. So that's a proposal to grant on the basis, can you be just clear on the basis of what you're proposing to grant, given the recommendations of the officers in respect of their comments on policy statements?
Yeah, so I'm proposing that this committee takes the view that with policy CS8 that this new application is in according with that. It is visually attractive and sympathetic, and it successfully seeks to ensure quality is not dismissed. What more do you need?
No, I think we've got that. Thank you, Councillor Holmes. You're saying it's a policy CS8 issue, that you disagree with the officers, and what you're basically saying is you think it's visually in accordance, attractive and sympathetic in that location.
Yeah, I'd like to hear my colleagues' opinions, but yeah, that's the that's the view that I have come to.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Holmes. I'd accept that proposal. Councillor Parker.
I think I'm bashing at the same door, but coming from a slightly different position. So this is a weighing of the benefit of the changes moving to a lower carbon house versus the loss of aesthetic quality. And as a council that has some years ago moved a motion for a climate emergency, I think it's good that we're grappling with this, and this shows that in fact we should be weighing the climate emergency and the net zero aspects more heavily than the aesthetics. There's no point in having the aesthetics if the River Avon is lapping a foot deep at the foundations of this house.
Okay, thank you. So are you seconding Councillor Holmes's proposal, Councillor Parker?
I really wanted to come at it more from the aspect, and I would need some help from officers on this, from the aspect of weighing the benefit of the reduced carbon versus the degradation to the aesthetic as they see it, and I'm sure.
Okay, so hold that thought for a moment then.
Yeah.
And let's hear from anybody else. Does anybody else like to comment on this application, enter the debate? Councillor Scorer, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just looking up on the two proposed, well, the left and right, I do like the style and design of the proposed planning on the left. And I'm looking, does the new passive build on the right outweigh the application, and which one should we go for? At the moment, I agree with the officers at the moment that actually the one on the left, I think that is better style and design. Whether that the applicant should come back and with a different style and design of materials, but at the moment I'm agreeing with the officers' recommendations.
Thank you, Councillor Scorer. I can see other hands going up now. So, Councillor Ostrander, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just wondering if we could have a slightly more nuanced suggestion by way of conditions. I mean, I don't know if they would pass the reasonableness test, but I think some of this is subjective, some aesthetically subjective. Which side of that picture do we all prefer? I'm sure we all have a view on that, but we're weighing that up against conservation issues, the perception of other people that live in that area, and of course the environment. And I absolutely do not want to discourage people from building passive houses. I really don't. So I'm loath to sort of throw the whole thing out and say, oh no, we can't do it on the basis of massing and how it looks, etc. But I do wish that the applicants had spent a bit more time exploring alternatives, or at least that we had that evidence here in front of us to consider. And so yes, so I go back to the question of could we consider any conditions that might improve some of the issues, some of the negative aspects of this, and yet retain the positive environmental aspects.
I think at that point I'll ask David if he'll comment on the cumulative impact of all these changes from the approved scheme to this new one.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think as officers, our assessment of the cumulative impact is set out in the report. As you have us as built environment professionals, the conservation officer is a built environment professional, advising you that from our point of view, we've looked at the sustainability benefits of this scheme, and we consider that those benefits don't outweigh the harm that it would cause. The applicants, you say, should explore alternatives, and would they be able to do that through conditions? Regrettably not. They chose not to follow a pre-app approach in advance of this application, the way that this council could require the applicants to explore alternatives which may also result in passive house development, which is less harmful, is to refuse it, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Councillor Harvey next.
Thank you. This is always difficult when you are required to make a decision which involves so much subjective judgment on questions of design. I suspect I know that this application, when originally considered, was considered not just by a single officer, but by, it went round the houses, so to speak. This is a view of the team, not just of one individual. What I do know is that this particular site is extremely sensitive. It may partly only lie within the conservation area, but it lies within sight, open sight of one of the rare Grade 1 listed buildings within Stratford. And my view is that I go along with all the comments about we do want to see environmental sensitive introductions where at all possible. I don't think that simply adopting what is proposed is going to stop the River Avon coming up by a foot on its own, but on the basis of the interpretation of the officers, it will have a detrimental impact on the visual appearance of the site. And weighing one against the other, given the experience of the officers, I'm prepared to back the officers and support refuse.
So, Councillor Harvey, can I take it that as a proposal to go with the officer's recommendation for the reasons set out in their report?
It is.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. Councillor Holmes, you had something else to say?
Yeah, I was just wondering, as a way of looking at it, is if we're comparing the two, is it not more so it's agreed that the one on the left complies with CS5 and CS8. So rather than bringing our, which ones do we prefer? Is it not? If the one on the left passes that test, should the other one also? And then rather than us choosing which one we prefer, should we be looking more? Does it pass that test? I don't know. I probably haven't explained that very well.
Thank you, Chair. The NPPF guides us that we should not materially diminish the quality of design through variations of schemes. So it is appropriate for us to consider whether the one on the left is preferable in design terms or in any other policy aspect.
Might I add my own thoughts before I come to you, Councillor Parker, please? I looked at the two, and to me, yes, there is this sort of subjectivity around design that we've all got in our minds, but we must rely upon the professional officers that we employ, the conservation officer and the planners, to determine to what extent the cumulative effect of these changes becomes harmful to this particular area. And I'll pick up on the point Councillor Harvey made, that whilst it's not a site that might that easily be seen into, it really is a prime site close to Holy Trinity Church. So we have to take account of the conservation officer's report on this. The other thing that strikes me is that we're actually on the left-hand side, we've got a scheme that was acceptable. And the applicants come forward with another scheme, apparently to meet passive house standards. A friend of mine's built a passive house, it looks nothing like that, so I know that you can achieve passive house standards with a different design. It's, you do need to perhaps reduce the number of windows and things like that, but it's quite feasible that the design could come forward that was more in accordance with the previous design, that would meet the tests that we require of it to not be harmful in that location, my opinion. So I've got Councillor Parker next, and then I'll come to you, Councillor Foreman. Councillor Parker.
Yes, I'll be brief, I think. So Mr. Jeffrey mentioned that the fenestration was significantly inferior on the proposal, and I would just venture the thought that the fenestration on the right is the correct fenestration, whether you like it or not, and the one on the left is inappropriate fenestration because it allows too much solar gain and thermal loss. So whether we like the aesthetic view of it or not, we don't have huge choices here.
Thank you, Councillor Parker. Councillor Fleming.
Keep mine brief as well. I'd like to second Councillor Harvey's proposal to accept the officer's recommendation.
Thank you very much, Councillor Fleming. Have we got any other contributions to the debate? No, in which case we do have a proposal and we have a seconder. And the proposal from Councillor Harvey is to accept the recommendations of the officers to refuse this application, which is application Spire View Garden, that's right, 24011171. So I'd like at this point to move to a vote on that proposal, please. Can I have a show of papers for those in favour of that proposal? So how many have we got?
That's 7, Chair.
And those against?
That's 2, Chair.
Thank you very much. So that proposal is carried. So this council resolves to refuse planning application 24/01171 variation, Spire View Garden, Saffron Meadow, Stratford-upon-Avon. Thank you. At that point, I think we can move to the next item on the agenda, which, would I be right in saying, is any other urgent business, Olivia?
No, Chairman.
It's not?
No urgent business.
Oh, it is the item on the agenda, but there isn't any.
No urgent
In which
business.
case, I'm happy to close the meeting. Thank you all for your attendance. Appreciate it.